Chapter 1. Convergence of Enemies. Molly Weasley could have been at the Burrow right now, kneading bread dough and listening to the wireless crackle with morning news. It would have been comfortingly normal, even with the headlines screaming about you-know-who's return. But normalcy was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when Albus had asked her to come to Hogwarts, not when the castle needed securing, and every adult hand was precious. The wrought iron gates of Hogwarts looked different to her now than they had during her own school days. Heavier somehow, more forbidding. 3 days had passed since the incident at the Ministry. 3 days since the entire wizarding world had been forced to accept what the Order of the Phoenix had known for months. Voldemort had returned. The photographs in the Daily Prophet were grainy and chaotic, but there was no mistaking the pale, serpentine face that had haunted her nightmares for over a decade. She pulled her travelling cloak tighter against the March wind that swept down from the Scottish Highlands. The morning air held the sharp bite of winter's last stand, though she could smell the faint promise of spring underneath. Daffodils were probably blooming in her garden at home. Arthur would be having his breakfast alone, scanning the headlines for any mention of their children's safety. The twins were old enough to take care of themselves, mostly, but Ron was still here at the castle, still in the thick of whatever mess Harry Potter seemed to attract like a lodestone. The thought of Harry made her chest tighten with a familiar ache. The boy had endured so much already, and now this. Now everyone knew the truth about you-know-who, but Harry had been living with that knowledge, carrying that burden, for months, while the rest of the world called him delusional. She'd wanted to fold him into one of her fierce hugs the last time she'd seen him at Christmas, wanted to tell him she believed him, had always believed him. But there had been too many people around, too many ears that might carry tales back to the wrong places. McGonagall met her at the castle's main entrance, looking older than Molly remembered. The deputy headmistress had always been stern, but there was something brittle about her now, as though she were holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Molly, thank you for coming," McGonagall said, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual. "I know Albus asked you to help with the security arrangements, but I'm afraid things have become rather complicated since yesterday." "More complicated than you-know-who being back?" Molly asked, following McGonagall through the familiar corridors. The castle felt oddly empty for mid-morning. Usually there would be students moving between classes, the sounds of lessons filtering through doorways. Dolores Umbridge was removed from her position 2 days ago, McGonagall explained, her voice carefully neutral. The Ministry has been scrambling to distance itself from her methods. With Albus handling the political fallout in London, I've been managing both the students and the security concerns. We've had 3 separate breach attempts since Sunday. They turned a corner, passing the moving staircases that had terrified and delighted Molly during her own Hogwarts years. Now they simply looked like another security vulnerability. How many places could someone hide in this castle? How many secret passages had the marauders never discovered? "Where do you need me?" she asked. "The protective wards around the castle need to be reinforced," McGonagall said. "With Albus away, we're operating with reduced magical coverage. I was hoping you could help me with the detection charms around the grounds. Your work with the Order has given you practical experience with the sort of protective magic we need now." Practical experience. That was one way to put it. Molly had learned to cast protective charms, not from textbooks, but from necessity, from desperation, from the bone-deep fear of watching her children grow up in a world at war. She'd learned to weave magic that could hide a house from Death Eater eyes, magic that could warn her if someone with dark intentions came too close to her family. They reached McGonagall's office, where parchment was stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. The older witch gestured to a chair, but remained standing herself, too wound up to sit still. "I'll need about an hour to finish these emergency student accommodations," McGonagall said, shuffling through a pile of letters. Several families have requested to remove their children from school early, given recent events. I can't say I blame them. If you could wait here until I'm finished, we can begin working on the ward reinforcements this afternoon. Molly nodded, settling into the offered chair. Through the window, she could see the lake stretching toward the forbidden forest. Somewhere out there, beyond the grounds, Death Eaters might be planning their next move. The thought made her hands curl into fists in her lap. She was so absorbed in watching for signs of movement near the forest edge that she didn't hear the soft knock on McGonagall's door, followed by the rustle of expensive robes and the distinctive click of well-heeled boots against stone. Narcissa Malfoy had not slept properly in 4 days. The elegant facade that had carried her through decades of pure-blood society events was beginning to crack, and she could feel it in the way her hands trembled slightly as she held Severus Snape's letter. The parchment was cream-colored and expensive, the sort of stationery that spoke of old money and older traditions, but the words written upon it were anything but comforting. "Mrs. Malfoy, your son's condition has deteriorated significantly since the minister's public acknowledgement of the Dark Lord's return. He has attended only half his classes this week and has not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. His friends report that he spends most of his time staring out the dormitory windows. While I understand the pressures your family is currently facing, I believe Draco would benefit from seeing a familiar face. I can arrange a meeting under the pretense of discussing his academic progress. S. Snape." The letter had arrived by owl at dawn, interrupting a sleepless night spent staring at her husband's empty chair in their drawing room. Lucius was still imprisoned in Azkaban, caught in the Department of Mysteries, along with the other Death Eaters, who had foolishly followed the Dark Lord into what had turned out to be a trap. The Daily Prophet was calling it a victory for the light, but Narcissa knew better. It was merely a setback, one that would likely make her husband's master even more dangerous when he inevitably freed his captured servants. But all of that paled beside her worry for Draco. Her 16-year-old son, who should be concerned with Quidditch matches and ordinary teenage troubles, was instead watching his family's world crumble around him. The boy had always been sensitive beneath his carefully cultivated Slytherin arrogance. Even as a child, he'd hidden his fears behind haughty superiority and cutting remarks. Now those defenses were failing him. The journey to Hogwarts had taken longer than usual. She'd been forced to take several indirect routes to avoid ministry checkpoints, and the reporters who seemed to be lurking around every corner, desperate for quotes from the families of captured Death Eaters. Her solicitor had advised her to stay out of public view until the legal situation became clearer, but maternal instinct trumped legal caution. Draco needed her. Professor McGonagall's office was on the 3rd floor, if she remembered correctly from her own school days. The castle looked unchanged from the outside, but there was something different about the atmosphere within. The students she passed in the corridors moved in tight groups, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward shadows that might hide threats. The war had followed them into their sanctuary. She knocked softly on McGonagall's office door, then entered when she heard the deputy headmistress's voice calling permission. Her greeting died on her lips when she saw who else was occupying the room. Molly Weasley sat in a chair beside McGonagall's desk, her red hair showing more grey than Narcissa remembered, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The woman looked as though she hadn't slept well recently either, and for a moment Narcissa was struck by an unexpected recognition. Here was another mother, another woman trying to protect her children in a world gone mad. The recognition lasted exactly as long as it took for Molly to look up and see who had entered. The Weasley woman's eyes went hard, her posture stiffening with the automatic hostility that had defined their family's relationship for generations. Pure blood versus blood traitor. Death Eater family versus Order of the Phoenix. The battle lines had been drawn long before either of them was born. "Mrs. Malfoy," McGonagall said, rising from behind her desk with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities. "I wasn't expecting you." "Professor Snape sent word that Draco was struggling," Narcissa replied, her voice carefully controlled. She did not look at Molly again, but she could feel the other woman's presence like a live wire in the room. "I've come to check on my son's welfare." "Of course," McGonagall said, "though I should mention that I'm rather busy this morning with security arrangements. Perhaps if you could wait for a short while, I can arrange for you to meet with Draco in my office after lunch." Narcissa inclined her head in acknowledgement. She had not expected immediate accommodation, not with the current state of affairs. The fact that McGonagall was willing to facilitate the meeting at all spoke to the older witch's fundamental decency, whatever her political affiliations might be. "Mrs. Weasley is here on order business," McGonagall continued, clearly feeling the need to explain the awkward situation. "I'm afraid with Professor Dumbledore in London handling ministry consultations, we're all managing multiple crises simultaneously." "I understand," Narcissa said. She did understand, perhaps better than McGonagall realized. Crisis management had become the defining feature of pure blood family life ever since the Dark Lord's return. Every day brought new challenges to navigate, new disasters to contain or minimize. An uncomfortable silence stretched between the three witches. McGonagall cleared her throat and shuffled through the papers on her desk, clearly searching for a graceful way to manage the situation. "I have several urgent matters to attend to," she said finally. "If you could both wait here for perhaps an hour, I can return to address your respective concerns properly." Without waiting for a response, McGonagall gathered an armload of parchments and hurried from the office, leaving the two mothers alone in a space that suddenly felt far too small. Narcissa remained standing near the door, her travel cloak still fastened around her shoulders. Molly continued to sit rigidly in her chair, staring determinedly out the window. Neither woman spoke, but the air between them fairly hummed with tension. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the castle grounds, casting everything in shades of grey that seemed to mirror the uncertain future stretching ahead of them all. Chapter 2. The Unguarded Office. The silence in McGonagall's office stretched like a taut wire between them, broken only by the soft scratching of the deputy headmistress's quill and the distant sounds of the castle settling around them. Molly kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching clouds gather over the lake, while Narcissa remained standing by the door like a pale sentinel in her travelling cloak. Neither woman acknowledged the other's presence, but Molly was acutely aware of every small sound Narcissa made: the whisper of expensive fabric when she shifted her weight, the soft intake of breath when she sighed almost inaudibly. It had been years since they'd been in the same room without the buffer of a crowd or the distraction of some public event. The last time might have been at Diagon Alley, that terrible day when Lucius had planted Tom Riddle's diary in Ginny's cauldron. The memory made Molly's hands clench involuntarily. McGonagall looked up from her correspondence, glancing between them with the weary expression of someone managing far too many complications at once. Before she could speak, however, a silver doe patronus bounded through the office window, landing gracefully on her desk. "Minerva," came Kingsley Shacklebolt's urgent voice from the ethereal deer. "We've detected Death Eater activity near Hogsmeade. 3 masked figures were spotted near the Shrieking Shack 20 minutes ago. We need you at the village immediately to coordinate the response." McGonagall was on her feet before the Patronus had fully faded, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Bloody hell, she muttered, then caught herself and shot an apologetic glance at her unexpected guests. I'm sorry, but this cannot wait. The security of the village. Go, Molly said immediately, understanding the urgency. Death Eater activity so close to the school could not be ignored, not with students still in the castle. We can wait. McGonagall nodded gratefully, already reaching for her travelling cloak. There's a house elf stationed in the corridor. Dippy, I think. Ask him to direct you somewhere more comfortable to wait. I'll return as soon as I can. She paused in the doorway, looking back at them with obvious reluctance. Please, try not to hex each other while I'm gone. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving them alone once again. But now the silence felt different, heavier, more charged with possibility. They were no longer under McGonagall's watchful supervision, no longer bound by the social niceties that her presence had demanded. Molly rose from her chair, smoothing down her robes. I suppose we should find somewhere else to wait, she said to the air, not quite looking at Narcissa, but addressing her nonetheless. Narcissa inclined her head in what might have been agreement. They moved toward the door in careful synchronization, both of them maintaining as much distance as the narrow office would allow. In the corridor outside, they found a small house elf, dusting a portrait frame with meticulous attention to detail. He was elderly for his kind, with wrinkled features and enormous ears that twitched when he heard their footsteps. Excuse me, Molly said gently, crouching down to the elf's eye level. Are you Dippy? Professor McGonagall said you could help us find somewhere to wait while she's away. The house elf's tennis ball eyes grew even larger. Oh yes, Mrs. Dippy is helping the important ladies. Professor McGonagall is telling Dippy that the ladies is waiting for Professor Dumbledore. Yes? Dippy is knowing exactly where the important ladies should be waiting. Narcissa frowned slightly. Actually, we were waiting to speak with Professor McGonagall, not... But Dippy had already begun shuffling down the corridor, beckoning for them to follow. This way, this way. Dippy is taking the ladies to Professor Dumbledore's office, where they is belonging. Much more comfortable than Deputy Headmistress's office. Yes, indeed. Molly exchanged a glance with Narcissa, the first direct eye contact they'd made since being left alone. Both women seemed to reach the same conclusion simultaneously. Correcting the house elf would take more time and effort than simply going along with his mistake. They followed him through the winding corridors of the castle, past moving portraits, whose occupants whispered among themselves as the unlikely pair passed by. The stone gargoyle that guarded the entrance to the headmaster's office was already rotating aside when they arrived, revealing the spiral staircase beyond. Dippy beamed at them proudly. Professor Dumbledore is at ministry meetings, but he is saying his office is always welcoming to friends of Hogwarts, the elf declared. Dippy is making tea if the ladies is wanting. That won't be necessary, Narcissa said quietly. But the house elf had already disappeared with a soft pop, leaving them standing at the base of the moving staircase. They rode up in silence, the stone steps carrying them steadily toward a door neither had expected to see today. When they reached the top, Molly hesitated with her hand on the brass door handle. This feels wrong, she murmured, more to herself than to Narcissa. We shouldn't be here without his permission. The house elf seemed to think we belonged here, Narcissa replied, though her voice carried the same uncertainty. And we were told to wait somewhere comfortable. Molly pushed open the door, and they stepped into Albus Dumbledore's private office. The circular room was exactly as Molly remembered from her own school days, though perhaps more cluttered now. Delicate silver instruments whirred and smoked on spindly tables, their purposes mysterious and vaguely unsettling. The walls were lined with portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses, though most appeared to be sleeping or pretending to sleep. Behind the massive desk, tall windows looked out over the castle grounds toward the Forbidden Forest, but it was the shallow stone basin sitting prominently on Dumbledore's desk that drew Molly's attention immediately. The pensive. She'd heard Arthur mention it in passing, but she'd never seen one before. Around it, Arranged with careful precision were dozens of small crystal bottles, each containing what appeared to be wisps of silver mist. Memories, she realized with a start. These were stored memories. Narcissa entered the office behind her, closing the door with a soft click. She too had noticed the pensieve, and her pale eyes lingered on the memory bottles with an expression Molly couldn't quite read. "We should sit down," Narcissa said finally, though she made no move to approach either of the chairs positioned in front of Dumbledore's desk. Instead, she remained near the door, as though ready to flee at a moment's notice. Molly nodded, but she too found herself reluctant to take liberties with the headmaster's furniture. The office felt too personal, too private. She could see books lying open on side tables, half-finished correspondence scattered across the desk's surface, a pair of spectacles folded carefully beside an inkwell. These were the intimate details of Dumbledore's daily life, and she felt like an intruder for witnessing them. A soft trill from the far corner of the room made both women turn. Fawkes the Phoenix sat on his golden perch, regarding them with bright, intelligent eyes. His scarlet and gold plumage seemed to glow in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, and there was something almost judgmental about his steady gaze. "Beautiful creature," Narcissa observed quietly, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression softened into something almost wistful. "I've never seen a phoenix before," Molly admitted. "Arthur's told me about them, but—" She trailed off, suddenly aware that she was making conversation with Narcissa Malfoy, of all people. The phoenix continued to watch them, turning his head from one woman to the other, as though evaluating their characters. He made no sound, no song of joy or warning cry, simply observed with the patient attention of a creature far older and wiser than either of them. Minutes passed. Molly finally settled into one of the chairs facing the desk, though she perched on its edge as though ready to leap up at any moment. Narcissa remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of the other chair, but not quite committing to sitting down. The tension between them was different here than it had been in McGonagall's office. There, they had been equals in discomfort, both of them waiting for the same authority figure to address their concerns. Here, surrounded by the artifacts of Dumbledore's power and wisdom, they were simply two women who had spent years on opposite sides of a war, trapped together by circumstance and a well-meaning house elf's misunderstanding. Molly found her gaze drifting back to the memory bottles arranged around the pensieve. So many of them, each one containing experiences and knowledge that Dumbledore had deemed worth preserving. What sorts of things did the headmaster consider important enough to extract from his own mind and store in crystal containers? "He collects them," Narcissa said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Memories. I've heard Severus mention it before." Molly looked up at her, surprised by the voluntary communication. "What does he do with them?" "Studies them, I suppose. Looks for patterns, connections that might not be obvious when the memories are still trapped in someone's head." Narcissa's fingers tightened slightly on the chair back. "Severus says he uses them to teach students about the past, about the consequences of choices." There was something in Narcissa's tone that suggested she found the practice unsettling, though she didn't elaborate. Molly could understand the feeling. There was something deeply intimate about memories, something that seemed almost violated by the act of removing them and storing them like specimens in jars. The afternoon light streaming through the windows had begun to shift, casting longer shadows across the office floor. How long had McGonagall been gone? How long would this Death Eater crisis in Hogsmeade require her attention? Molly shifted uncomfortably in her chair, acutely aware of how inappropriate their presence here was beginning to feel. Narcissa seemed to be having similar thoughts. She moved restlessly around the perimeter of the office, careful not to touch anything, but clearly struggling with the forced inactivity. When she passed too close to a particularly delicate-looking silver instrument, It began to emit a high-pitched whining sound that made both women freeze. "Don't touch anything," Molly said quickly, and Narcissa stepped back as though burned. "I wasn't going to," Narcissa replied, but her tone lacked its usual frost. She seemed as unsettled by their surroundings as Molly felt. Fawkes ruffled his feathers and tucked his head under one wing, apparently deciding that whatever drama was unfolding between the two witches was not worth his continued attention. The gesture somehow made their situation feel even more surreal. Here they were, two enemies forced into an awkward truce by circumstances beyond their control, while a legendary phoenix treated their presence as routine. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the office windows. The sound was oddly soothing, a natural rhythm that helped to ease some of the tension that had been building between them. But beneath that surface calm, Molly could feel something else stirring, a growing awareness that this moment, this unexpected convergence, might be more significant than either of them realized. They were here, in the heart of Dumbledore's private domain, surrounded by the tools and artifacts he used to fight their war. And for the first time in years, they were looking at each other, not as enemies on a battlefield, but simply as two women caught in circumstances beyond their control. It was not exactly trust, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something else entirely, something that made the air between them feel charged with possibility. Chapter 3. The File That Changes Everything. The rain had intensified against the office windows, creating a steady drumbeat that seemed to emphasize the strange intimacy of their situation. Molly found herself studying the memory bottles more closely, trying to decipher the small, neat labels attached to each crystal container. Most were written in Dumbledore's familiar, spidery script, but the writing was too small to read from her position in the chair. Narcissa had been standing motionless near the door for nearly 10 minutes, and Molly could sense the other woman's growing restlessness. The Malfoy matriarch was clearly unaccustomed to such enforced idleness, particularly in the company of someone she considered an enemy. Every few moments, she would shift her weight or adjust her traveling cloak, small gestures that spoke of barely contained energy. "You could sit down," Molly offered quietly, surprising herself with the suggestion. "We might be waiting for quite some time." Narcissa's pale eyes flicked toward the empty chair beside Molly's, then away again. "I'm perfectly comfortable standing, thank you." The formality of her response created another bubble of silence between them. Molly turned back to the windows, watching the storm clouds roll across the Scottish hills. Somewhere out there, McGonagall was dealing with Death Eaters near Hogsmeade. Somewhere else, Arthur was probably pacing their kitchen, wondering when she would return home safely. And here she sat, in the heart of Hogwarts, trapped in an increasingly surreal situation with a woman whose husband had tried to kill her daughter. The memory made her jaw tighten. Ginny, barely 11 years old, possessed by Tom Riddle's diary, the diary that Lucius Malfoy had planted in her cauldron, knowing full well what horrors it contained. Molly's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap, and she saw Narcissa notice the movement from the corner of her eye. "Mrs. Weasley," Narcissa said suddenly, her voice carefully neutral, "I want you to know that I had no knowledge of what my husband planned to do with that diary." The unexpected words hit Molly like a physical blow. She turned to stare at the other woman, searching her pale features for any sign of deception. "What?" "Ginny," Narcissa continued, her composure cracking slightly. "Your daughter. What Lucius did to her. I didn't know. He told me he was simply disposing of some old dark artifacts by passing them along to Muggle-born families. I thought it was petty vindictiveness, not—" She swallowed hard. "Not attempted murder." Molly felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't even realized was there. The admission didn't erase what had happened, didn't undo the months of terror and guilt that had followed Ginny's possession. But it changed something fundamental about how she saw the woman standing across from her. She almost died, Molly said quietly, in the Chamber of Secrets. If Harry hadn't found her when he did. I know. Narcissa's voice was barely a whisper. I've read the reports. What I don't understand is how Albus allowed it to happen in the first place. Surely there were protections, safeguards. She trailed off, and both women found themselves looking at the pensive and its surrounding memory bottles with new eyes. What kinds of safeguards had Dumbledore put in place to protect the students? And why had they failed when Ginny needed them most? Narcissa moved restlessly away from the door, her discomfort with standing still finally overriding her reluctance to come closer to Molly. But instead of approaching the chairs, she drifted toward the side of the office, where tall bookcases lined the walls. Her movements were careful, controlled, but there was something brittle about her posture that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. As she passed one of the smaller tables near Dumbledore's desk, her trailing cloak caught on its edge. The table rocked slightly, and a neat stack of files that had been balanced precariously near its corner began to slide. Oh no! Narcissa lunged forward to catch them, but it was too late. The files tumbled to the floor in a cascade of parchment and photographs, spreading across the Persian rug in a chaos of official seals and formal letterheads. Both women stared at the mess in horror, realizing simultaneously how terrible this looked. Two enemies alone in Dumbledore's office, rifling through his private documents. We have to clean this up, Molly said urgently, rising from her chair. Before he comes back. They dropped to their knees simultaneously, each reaching for the scattered papers with the desperate efficiency of people trying to hide evidence of an accident. But as Molly's hands closed around the first sheet of parchment, the words printed across its header made her freeze. Harry James Potter, classified, Dursley Household Monitoring. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Harry's name, on official documents, hidden away in Dumbledore's private files. She looked up to find Narcissa staring at another piece of parchment with an expression of growing horror. Medical assessment, Narcissa read aloud, her voice barely audible. Patient shows signs of chronic malnutrition, consistent with deliberate food restriction. Multiple healed fractures in various stages of... She stopped, the paper trembling in her hands. This is about Harry Potter. Molly looked down at her own document, scanning the neat lines of text that detailed magical monitoring spells placed on number 4, Privet Drive. Spells that recorded everything, every raised voice, every punishment, every night Harry had gone to bed hungry. Spells that fed information directly back to Albus Dumbledore. He knew, she whispered, the words falling like stones into the silence between them. Albus knew what they were doing to him. Narcissa had found another document, this one bearing the seal of St. Mungo's. Healer's report from July 1991, she read, her composure cracking with each word. Patient brought in after accidental magic incident. Extensive bruising consistent with physical assault. Patient claims he fell downstairs, but magical examination reveals... She couldn't finish. They continued to gather the scattered papers, no longer trying to organize them properly, but simply collecting evidence of a horror that neither had imagined possible. Photographs fell from between official reports, pictures that made Molly's stomach lurch. Harry at age 7, so thin his ribs were visible through his oversized clothes. Harry at age 9, with a black eye that no amount of concealing charms could fully hide. Harry at age 11, the morning before his Hogwarts letter arrived, standing in what appeared to be a cupboard barely large enough to hold a cot. A cupboard, Narcissa breathed, staring at the same photograph. They kept him in a cupboard. More papers revealed themselves as they worked. Correspondence between Dumbledore and Ministry officials discussing the necessary maintenance of adverse conditions for Harry's character development. Reports from Privet Drive detailing exactly how the Dursleys' treatment was affecting Harry's magical core, written with the clinical detachment of an ongoing experiment. But it was a letter dated from Harry's second year that made both women stop gathering papers entirely. Albus, the letter began, written in unfamiliar handwriting. The boy's magical development is proceeding exactly as you predicted. The stress-induced fluctuations in his core magic are creating the precise conditions necessary for the binding to take hold. However, I must express some concern about the physical toll this is taking. The monitoring spells show significant deterioration in his overall health since the beginning of this school year. Perhaps we should consider moderating the environmental pressures. Dumbledore's response was clipped to the back of the letter. The process cannot be interrupted at this crucial stage. Harry's development must proceed naturally, regardless of temporary discomfort. The greater good demands this sacrifice. Molly felt bile rise in her throat. Binding, she repeated numbly. What kind of binding? Narcissa had gone very still, clutching a handful of documents to her chest. Experimental magical procedures, she said in a hollow voice. They've been experimenting on him since he was a baby. The Persian rug beneath them was now covered with evidence of systematic abuse and manipulation spanning 15 years. Medical reports, correspondence, photographs, and monitoring data that painted a picture of deliberate torture disguised as character building. And at the center of it all, Albus Dumbledore, orchestrating every detail with the patience of a master strategist. How long? Molly asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Narcissa shuffled through the papers in her hands until she found what appeared to be the earliest document. Her face went even paler as she read the date. October 1981, she whispered. 3 weeks after his parents died. They started monitoring him 3 weeks after the attack. 3 weeks. Harry had been 15 months old, orphaned and traumatized, placed with relatives who despised him. And instead of ensuring his safety and happiness, Dumbledore had begun treating him like a laboratory specimen. Both women sat back on their heels, surrounded by the evidence of a betrayal so massive that it dwarfed every conflict they had ever had with each other. The war between light and dark, the conflict between pure-blood supremacists and blood traitors, the ancient feuds between their families, all of it seemed suddenly trivial in the face of what they had discovered. Those people, Narcissa said slowly, her voice thick with disgust. Those muggles who raised him. They knew they were hurting him, and they did it anyway. For years. And Dumbledore let them, Molly finished, the words feeling like poison on her tongue. He not only let them, he encouraged it. He needed Harry to suffer. The rain continued to drum against the windows, but neither woman noticed. They were too busy staring at the scattered evidence of the most monstrous betrayal either had ever witnessed. Harry Potter, the boy they had both watched grow up, one with motherly affection, the other with wary respect, had been systematically tortured and manipulated by the very people who claimed to be protecting him. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, and footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Someone was returning to the castle, perhaps from the crisis in Hogsmeade. But neither Molly nor Narcissa moved to clean up the scattered files or return to their proper places in the office. They had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The evidence surrounding them had changed everything, not just their understanding of Harry Potter's life, but their understanding of the war itself, of the man they had trusted to lead them through it. And as they knelt together on the Persian rug, surrounded by the proof of Dumbledore's crimes, they realized that they were no longer enemies, separated by ideology and family loyalty. They were mothers united by a horror so profound that it demanded justice, regardless of the cost. Chapter 4. Mothers United in Horror. The footsteps in the corridor passed by without stopping, fading into the distance as whoever it was continued deeper into the castle. Both women remained frozen among the scattered documents, listening to the retreating sounds with the guilty tension of children caught doing something forbidden. When silence returned, broken only by the steady drumbeat of rain against the windows, they slowly turned back to the evidence surrounding them. "This can't be real," Molly whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. She was clutching a photograph of Harry at age 6, his small face gaunt with hunger, his eyes holding a wariness that no child should possess. Albus wouldn't. He couldn't. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. The evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed, too meticulously documented to be fabricated. This was real. This was systematic. This was deliberate. Narcissa had risen to her feet and was now examining the memory bottles arranged around the pensieve, reading their labels with the focused attention of someone seeking confirmation of a terrible suspicion. Her pale fingers trembled slightly as she lifted one crystal vial, squinting at the tiny script wrapped around its base. "Blood ward maintenance through systematic undernourishment," she read aloud, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Signed APWB Dumbledore." She set the bottle down as though it had burned her fingers. He documented it. He documented the starvation as a necessary component of the protective magic. Molly felt her world tilt sideways. Blood wards. She'd heard Arthur mention them in passing, ancient magic that required specific conditions to maintain. But she'd never imagined that those conditions included deliberate abuse of the person being protected. "There are more," Narcissa continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. She moved methodically from bottle to bottle, reading labels that catalogued years of calculated cruelty. Emotional isolation protocols, friendship manipulation strategies, academic performance management through controlled stress application. Each label was like a dagger thrust into everything Molly had believed about the man who led their cause. They worked together now without conscious decision, no longer enemies but partners in uncovering a horror that dwarfed their previous conflicts. Molly gathered the scattered correspondence, while Narcissa catalogued the memory vials. The division of labor felt natural, efficient, as though they had been investigating together for years rather than minutes. "Here," Molly said, her voice thick with disgust, as she found a file marked Gift Interception Protocols. "Look at this." She spread the documents across Dumbledore's desk, not caring anymore about propriety or permission. "Every package I ever sent to Harry, every sweater, every bit of food, every Christmas present. He's been intercepting them." The file contained detailed records spanning years, lists of confiscated gifts, assessments of their potential impact on subjects' psychological conditioning, and cold calculations about which items could be safely delivered and which must be withheld to maintain optimal stress levels. Molly's handwritten cards were attached to many of the entries, her expressions of love and concern reduced to clinical data points in Dumbledore's grand experiment. "December 1993, Narcissa read from one entry, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Subject's emotional state remains adequately fragile. Mrs. Weasley's attempted care package has been intercepted and destroyed. The warm socks would have provided too much comfort during the winter isolation period." She looked up at Molly, her pale eyes burning with an anger that matched Molly's own. "He destroyed your gifts to keep Harry cold and miserable." Molly's hands clenched into fists. Every sleepless night she'd spent knitting by wandlight, every carefully selected treat she'd wrapped with her own hands, every attempt to show Harry that someone cared about his well-being. All of it had been systematically stolen and discarded like garbage. "And this," Narcissa continued, pulling another file from the scattered papers. "This explains everything about Lucius." Her voice had gone very quiet, the kind of stillness that preceded either collapse or explosion. "Dumbledore has been feeding my husband information, encouraging his obsession with Potter, guiding his attacks to ensure they happened at precisely the right moments to maximize psychological impact." She handed the file to Molly, who read it with growing horror. It was all there, documentation of how Dumbledore had manipulated Lucius's natural arrogance and prejudice, turning him into an unwitting tool for Harry's psychological conditioning. The diary incident, the confrontations at school, even the Death Eater raid on the Department of Mysteries, all of it carefully orchestrated to ensure that Harry faced exactly the right amount of threat at precisely the right times. "He used your husband," Molly said quietly, "just like he used everyone else." "Used him and then discarded him," Narcissa replied, her composure finally cracking. Lucius thought he was serving the Dark Lord, but he was really serving Dumbledore's agenda. We all were. She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and broken. "Do you know what the worst part is? I was proud of Lucius for finally taking action against Potter. I thought he was showing initiative, finally stepping up to support our cause. Instead, he was dancing to Dumbledore's tune like a marionette." They continued to work through the files, sharing discoveries that painted an increasingly complete picture of manipulation and betrayal. Every relationship in Harry's life had been touched by Dumbledore's interference. His friendship with Ron and Hermione carefully managed to ensure he had support, but not too much independence. His conflicts with Snape, deliberately maintained to create optimal stress responses. Even his connection with Sirius Black had been monitored and guided, his godfather's freedom timed to provide exactly the right emotional impact at exactly the right moment. "Ron," Molly whispered, staring at a file that detailed how her youngest son's friendship with Harry had been encouraged through strategic placement and managed circumstances. "He put Ron on the train next to Harry. He made sure they met, made sure they bonded." She looked up at Narcissa with tears in her eyes. "My son's entire friendship with Harry is a lie. It's an arranged relationship designed to serve Dumbledore's purposes. All of our children," Narcissa said softly. "They're all pawns in his game." She held up a document marked with Draco's name. "Psychological profile. Subject shows optimal potential for creating controlled antagonism with primary subject. Recommend encouraging competitive behaviors and class-based prejudices to maintain appropriate tension levels." Her voice broke slightly. "He's been using Draco to torment Harry since they were 11 years old. Every cruel word, every petty rivalry, it was all part of the plan. The magnitude of the betrayal was overwhelming. Not just Harry, but all of their children, manipulated and used as tools in Dumbledore's grand design. Ron turned into an unwitting spy in his best friend's life. Draco molded into a perfect antagonist to keep Harry under constant stress. Hermione placed strategically to provide academic support while maintaining emotional distance. Ginny positioned as both victim and eventual romantic interest, her trauma from the diary incident calculated to create the precise emotional connection Dumbledore required." Molly sank into Dumbledore's chair behind the massive desk, no longer caring about the impropriety of taking such liberties. The weight of what they had discovered was crushing, too immense to process while standing. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Narcissa was examining what appeared to be the oldest file in the collection, its parchment yellowed with age. "From the beginning," she said quietly. "From the night his parents died. Perhaps even before that." She opened the ancient folder carefully, revealing documents that predated Harry's birth. "Lily and James Potter, Breeding Program Assessment," she read. "Magical Compatibility Analysis, Genetic Projection Models for Offspring Magical Potential." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with the weight of a collapsing building. Even Harry's parents hadn't escaped Dumbledore's manipulation. Their relationship, their marriage, possibly even Harry's conception, had been guided by the headmaster's invisible hand, all in service of creating the perfect weapon against Voldemort. "He arranged everything," Molly said, her voice hollow with shock. "Harry's entire existence is the result of Dumbledore's planning. His parents' marriage, his birth, his abuse, his friendships, his enemies, all of it orchestrated from the beginning." They sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal either had ever witnessed. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and somewhere in the castle, life went on as normal. Students attended classes, teachers delivered lessons, house elves prepared meals. But here in this office, two mothers had uncovered a truth so monstrous that it changed everything they thought they knew about their world. "We can't leave," Narcissa said finally, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Not until we know everything. Not until we understand the full scope of what he's done." Molly nodded, feeling something cold and hard settling in her chest where her trust in Dumbledore used to live. "No one else can see this. Not yet. Not until we decide what to do with it." "Agreed." Narcissa moved to the office door and quietly turned the lock, sealing them in with their terrible discovery. "We have hours before anyone expects either of us to be anywhere else. We use that time to read everything, to understand everything." They looked at each other across the scattered evidence of Dumbledore's crimes, and Molly saw her own determination reflected in the other woman's pale eyes. They were no longer Molly Weasley and Narcissa Malfoy, blood traitor and pure blood supremacist, Order member and Death Eater wife. They were two mothers who had stumbled upon evidence of systematic child abuse, and nothing else mattered anymore. "Where do we start?" Molly asked. Narcissa surveyed the chaos of documents with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to managing complex information. "Chronologically," she decided. "We start with his parents and work forward. We're going to understand exactly how Dumbledore created Harry Potter, and exactly what he plans to do with him." They bent to their task with the focused intensity of people who had found a purpose worth any sacrifice. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the locked office, two unlikely allies began the process of unraveling decades of carefully constructed lies. Whatever they found in these files would change everything, not just their understanding of Harry's life, but their understanding of the war itself, and their own roles in the tragedy that Dumbledore had orchestrated from the shadows. Chapter 5. The Memory Vault. The pensive sat before them like an accusation, its stone surface rippling with an otherworldly light that seemed to beckon and warn simultaneously. Molly stared into its depths, while Narcissa systematically arranged the memory vials they had selected, each one containing evidence that would either confirm or contradict the horrifying picture painted by the documents. "Are you certain about this?" Molly asked quietly. She had never used a pensieve before, had only heard Arthur describe the sensation in vague terms. The idea of diving into Dumbledore's actual memories, of witnessing his thoughts and decisions firsthand, felt like a violation of the most intimate kind. "The documents could be forgeries," Narcissa replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Memories are harder to fake, especially ones stored by the person who experienced them." She held up a vial, labeled in Dumbledore's distinctive script. "Initial Dursley Assessment. November 1981. If we're going to accuse the most powerful wizard in Britain of systematically torturing a child, we need to be absolutely certain of our facts." Molly nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart rebelled against the necessity. They had crossed too many lines already to turn back now. If they were wrong, if somehow all of this evidence was an elaborate deception, then they would face the consequences of their accusations. But if they were right... Narcissa uncorked the first vial with steady hands, pouring its silvery contents into the pensieve. The memory swirled in the stone basin, taking on substance and depth until it resembled a window into the past. Both women leaned forward simultaneously, their faces illuminated by the ethereal glow. "Together," Narcissa said, and they plunged into the memory as one. The sensation was like diving into cold water that turned out to be made of light and thought instead of liquid. Molly felt herself tumbling through space and time until her feet touched solid ground in what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary suburban street. Privet Drive, she realized with a start. She had never been here before, but she recognized it from Harry's reluctant descriptions. It was November, barely 3 weeks after Voldemort's attack on the Potter cottage. The street was quiet in the early morning light, with frost gleaming on car windshields and the first hints of winter in the bare tree branches. Number 4 looked exactly like every other house on the street, tidy, unremarkable, aggressively normal. A younger Dumbledore stood beneath a street lamp, his phoenix-feathered cloak billowing in the cold wind. His face was grave, his blue eyes shadowed with what might have been sorrow or calculation. In his arms, wrapped in a thin blanket that was clearly inadequate for the weather, was 15-month-old Harry Potter. The baby was asleep, his small face peaceful despite the circumstances that had brought him here. Dark hair fell across his forehead, hiding the lightning bolt scar that would define his life. He looked so small, so vulnerable, that Molly felt her heart constrict with protective instinct. Dumbledore approached the front door of number 4 with measured steps, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He set the sleeping child on the doorstep as though he were delivering a package, tucking a letter under the blanket with mechanical efficiency. Then he stepped back, drew his wand, and began casting spells with practiced precision. Molly watched in growing horror as layer after layer of surveillance charms settled over the house like an invisible web, monitoring spells that would record every conversation, every punishment, every moment of suffering. Detection charms that would alert him to the child's emotional state, his magical development, his physical condition, and binding spells, complex, dark magic that would ensure the blood wards held strong no matter what horrors were inflicted upon the boy they were meant to protect. "My God," she whispered, but her voice made no sound in the memory. They were observers here, witnesses to events long past, unable to intervene or alter what they were seeing. The worst part was Dumbledore's expression as he completed his spell work. There was no regret, no hesitation, no sign that he was troubled by what he was condemning Harry to endure. His face held the calm satisfaction of a man who had solved a complex problem efficiently. He had found the perfect tool for maintaining the blood wards, and the fact that this tool was a traumatized toddler seemed to be of no consequence whatsoever. As the sun began to rise over Privet Drive, Dumbledore took one final look at the sleeping child on the doorstep, then disapparated with a soft pop, leaving Harry alone and defenseless in a world that would soon teach him that love was conditional and safety was temporary. The memory dissolved around them, and they found themselves back in the headmaster's office, gasping as though they had been holding their breath underwater. Molly's hands were shaking, and she could see that Narcissa's face had gone even paler than usual. "He knew," Molly said, her voice barely audible. "Before he even left Harry there, he knew exactly what those people would do to him. That's why he chose them." Narcissa was already reaching for the second vial, her movements sharp with suppressed fury. "This one is dated 1985. Harry would have been 4 years old." The second memory pulled them into Hogwarts itself, into the very office where they now sat, though it appeared somewhat different in the past. A younger Severus Snape stood before Dumbledore's desk, his black robes billowing with barely contained agitation. "The boy is being systematically abused," Snape was saying, his voice tight with what might have been concern or anger. "The monitoring spells are quite clear about that. Physical violence, emotional manipulation, deliberate starvation, they are destroying him piece by piece." Dumbledore looked up from the parchment he had been writing, his expression mildly interested rather than alarmed. "And how is his magical development progressing?" "Exactly as you predicted," Snape replied through gritted teeth. "The constant stress is creating the precise fluctuations in his core magic that you outlined in your original assessment. But Albus, at what cost? The child is 4 years old. He sleeps in a cupboard. He believes that love is something other people receive, but never him." "Excellent," Dumbledore said, with the satisfaction of a researcher whose experiment was proceeding according to plan. "The emotional isolation is particularly crucial during these formative years. A child who expects nothing will be grateful for any small kindness, making him far more malleable and willing to sacrifice himself when the time comes." Molly felt bile rise in her throat. They were discussing Harry as though he were a laboratory specimen, not a living child with feelings and needs and the right to basic human dignity. "Perhaps we could moderate the conditions slightly," Snape suggested, though his tone suggested he held little hope for agreement. Ensure he receives adequate nutrition, at least. The physical deterioration is becoming quite pronounced. No, Dumbledore said firmly. Every aspect of Harry's environment has been carefully calibrated to produce the desired psychological profile. The hunger teaches him that resources are scarce and must be earned through pleasing others. The isolation teaches him to value any social connection, no matter how manipulative. The abuse teaches him that pain is normal, making him less likely to avoid dangerous situations when we require his courage. He looked directly at Snape, his blue eyes hard as diamonds. We are creating the perfect weapon, Severus. Weapons require tempering. The memory faded, leaving both women staring at each other in sick recognition of what they had witnessed. This was not neglect or incompetence. This was deliberate psychological engineering on a scale that defied comprehension. "The third one," Narcissa said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her eyes. "Let's see what other atrocities our beloved headmaster has documented for posterity." This memory was more recent, dated just 2 years ago during Harry's 3rd year at Hogwarts. They found themselves in a comfortable sitting room that Molly didn't recognize, watching Dumbledore share tea with a witch she identified as Amelia Bones from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. "The Potter boy seems to be developing quite well under your guidance," Bones was saying, stirring sugar into her tea. "Though I must say, some of my investigators have expressed concern about his home situation. We've received several anonymous tips over the years suggesting that his Muggle relatives are less than kind." Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but Molly noticed how his fingers tightened slightly around his teacup. "Harry is exactly where he needs to be, Amelia. The protection afforded by his mother's blood sacrifice requires that he call that place home, however temporarily each summer." "But surely there are other options," Bones pressed. "The Weasley family has expressed interest in having him stay with them more permanently. Young Harry seems quite attached to their youngest son, and Molly Weasley has a reputation for taking in strays. She'd treat him like one of her own." "I'm afraid that would be quite impossible," Dumbledore replied smoothly. "Harry's psychological development requires a very specific environment. Too much affection too early would make him soft, unwilling to make the necessary sacrifices when the time comes. He must learn that love is earned, not freely given." Molly felt as though she had been punched in the chest. She had offered, repeatedly, to give Harry a permanent home. She had begged Arthur to make formal inquiries through the ministry, had volunteered to take on the legal guardianship herself, if necessary. She had assumed that Dumbledore's polite deflections were based on legitimate concerns about blood ward protection, not a calculated effort to keep Harry miserable and desperate for affection. "The boy will return to his relatives each summer," Dumbledore continued with finality. "It is essential for his development that he understand his place in the world, that he does not become too comfortable or expect too much happiness. We need him grateful for small mercies, not demanding of greater ones." The memory dissolved, but its implications lingered in the air between them like a poison gas. Molly was weeping now, tears of rage and grief streaming down her cheeks as she thought of all the summers Harry could have spent at the Burrow, all the love and safety they could have given him, if only they had known the truth. The fourth memory was the most recent, dated just last summer, before Harry's 5th year. They watched Dumbledore meet with ministry officials to discuss Harry's continued placement with the Dursleys, despite increasing evidence of abuse that even the bureaucrats were beginning to notice. "Perhaps a foster placement within the magical community," one official suggested. "The Black family estate is available, and Sirius Black is the boy's legal godfather." "Absolutely not," Dumbledore replied with unusual sharpness. "Sirius Black's influence would be catastrophic for Harry's development. The man would actually treat Harry with kindness and respect, would make him feel valued and loved. We cannot afford such luxuries when we are preparing him for his ultimate purpose." By the time they emerged from the final memory, Both women were shaking with a combination of horror and rage that threatened to overwhelm their ability to think rationally. They had witnessed 15 years of calculated torture, documented with the dispassionate precision of a scientific study. Every choice Dumbledore had made regarding Harry had been designed to maximize his suffering while maintaining the pretense of protection. Every friendship, Molly said through her tears. Every moment of happiness. Every small kindness. All of it carefully monitored and controlled to ensure he never felt too secure, never expected too much. Even his godfather, Narcissa added, her voice deadly quiet. Even the one person who had a legal right to love him unconditionally was kept away because love might have interfered with the conditioning process. They sat in the aftermath of their discoveries, surrounded by the evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal either had ever witnessed. Harry Potter had never had a real choice in anything. Not his friends, not his enemies, not his home, not even his basic human right to safety and affection. He had been shaped and molded like clay in a potter's hands, crafted into the perfect weapon for Dumbledore's war. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but inside the locked office, two mothers sat in the wreckage of everything they had believed about the man they had trusted to lead their cause. The evidence was complete, the pattern undeniable. Now came the question that would define everything that followed. What were they going to do about it? Chapter 6. The Confrontation Planned. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor outside broke through their horrified contemplation like a crack of thunder. Both women froze, still sitting among the scattered evidence of Dumbledore's crimes, suddenly aware of how damning their position would appear to anyone entering the office. "Someone's coming," Narcissa whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. "Quickly, we need to—" They moved with desperate efficiency, born of mutual understanding. Narcissa began gathering the scattered files with practiced speed, while Molly hastily returned the memory vials to their positions around the pensive. Years of managing a chaotic household had given Molly an intuitive sense for restoring order from chaos, while Narcissa's experience with high-stakes social situations had taught her the art of appearing innocent under scrutiny. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the distinctive tap-tap of a walking stick against stone. Dumbledore. They had perhaps 30 seconds before he reached his office door. "The papers aren't in the right order," Molly said quietly, her hands trembling as she tried to stack the files exactly as they had been before Narcissa's cloak had disturbed them. "It doesn't matter," Narcissa replied, using her wand to perform a subtle cleaning charm that erased any obvious signs of their investigation. "He'll notice if we're not sitting where we should be." They threw themselves into the chairs facing Dumbledore's desk, just as the door handle began to turn. Molly's heart was beating so hard she was certain it must be audible, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to appear as though she had been patiently waiting rather than systematically uncovering 15 years of documented child abuse. The door opened to reveal Albus Dumbledore in his full regalia, midnight blue robes embroidered with stars, half-moon spectacles perched on his crooked nose, and that familiar grandfatherly smile that now looked to Molly like the expression of a predator. His blue eyes, which she had always found comforting, now seemed to pierce right through her as though he could read every thought in her head. "Mrs. Weasley, Mrs. Malfoy," he said, his voice carrying its usual warmth and slight amusement. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you both here. I do hope Dippy has been taking proper care of you in my absence." "Professor Dumbledore," Molly managed, forcing her voice to sound normal despite the sick knowledge now churning in her stomach. "We were waiting for Professor McGonagall, but there was some confusion about where we should wait." "Ah, yes. The house elves sometimes become over-enthusiastic in their helpfulness," Dumbledore said, settling behind his desk with the easy confidence of a man completely comfortable in his own domain. "I trust you haven't been too uncomfortable. I know these chairs aren't the most welcoming for extended periods." Narcissa inclined her head politely, her expression carefully neutral. "We've been quite comfortable, thank you. Though I confess, I found myself wondering about young Mr. Potter's well-being. My son Draco has mentioned that he seems troubled this year." Molly shot her a quick glance, impressed despite herself by the other woman's tactical approach. Narcissa was probing for information while maintaining perfect, plausible deniability. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but Molly caught a flicker of something. Wariness? Calculation? In his pale blue eyes. "Harry has indeed faced some challenges this year," he said smoothly. "But I believe such difficulties are ultimately beneficial for a young man of his unique circumstances. Character is forged in adversity, as they say." The casual dismissal of Harry's suffering, delivered in that same warm, grandfatherly tone Dumbledore had used to comfort her own children over the years, made Molly's hands clench involuntarily in her lap. She fought to keep her voice steady as she asked, "But surely there must be ways to help him. As someone who cares about his welfare, I can't help but worry." "Your maternal instincts do you credit, Molly," Dumbledore replied, and the condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable to her now sensitized ears. "However, I'm afraid that excessive coddling would not serve Harry's best interests in the long run. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for those we care about is to allow them to face their challenges without our interference." Narcissa leaned forward slightly, her pale eyes fixed on Dumbledore's face with the intensity of a hunting bird. "Forgive my curiosity, but what sort of challenges? Draco has mentioned that Potter spends his summers with Muggle relatives who seem less than ideal guardians." "The Dursleys serve their purpose," Dumbledore said, his tone carrying a note of finality that would normally have ended the conversation. "Harry's placement with them is essential for his protection, as well as his development as a person. The blood wards created by his mother's sacrifice require that he call their house home, however briefly, each summer." Molly felt sick. Even now, knowing what she knew about Dumbledore's true motivations, his explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. How many times over the years had she accepted similar reassurances? How many opportunities had she missed to push harder, to demand better answers about Harry's welfare? "Of course," she said carefully, "though I do hope he knows that he has people who care about him. People who would be willing to help if he needed it." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Dumbledore's expression, a tightening around his eyes that suggested he was beginning to wonder about the nature of their questions. "Harry is well aware of the affection many people hold for him," he said, "though I do try to ensure he doesn't develop unrealistic expectations about the level of support available to him. Independence and self-reliance are crucial qualities for someone in his position." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with both women probing delicately for information, while Dumbledore deflected their questions with his usual mixture of wisdom and evasion. But every word he spoke now carried a different weight for Molly and Narcissa. They could hear the calculated cruelty behind his gentle suggestions that Harry needed to learn to rely on himself. They could see the manipulation in his warnings about the dangers of giving the boy too much comfort or affection. Finally, Dumbledore glanced at his pocket watch and rose from his chair. "I'm afraid I have another appointment," he said apologetically. "Professor McGonagall should return shortly to address your respective concerns. Please continue to make yourselves comfortable." He moved toward the door with his characteristic unhurried stride, but paused with his hand on the handle. "I trust your conversation this afternoon has been illuminating?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made both women's blood run cold. "Indeed," Narcissa replied smoothly. "Quite educational." Dumbledore's smile was warm and meaningless. "Excellent. I do so enjoy it when bright minds find opportunities to expand their understanding." He opened the door, then looked back over his shoulder. "Do give my regards to your families. I hope they continue to remain safe and well." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving them alone once again. For several moments, neither woman spoke, both of them processing the subtle threats woven through Dumbledore's parting words. He knows, Molly said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Or at least, he suspects. Yes, Narcissa agreed, her composure cracking slightly. We've overplayed our hand. The questions were too pointed, too focused on Harry specifically. They sat in tense silence, listening to Dumbledore's footsteps fade down the corridor. Only when they were certain he was gone did Narcissa rise and move to the filing cabinet, where she had seen him replace one of the documents they had been examining. "We need copies," she said urgently, drawing her wand. "Everything we've seen, everything we've learned. We need proof that can't be destroyed or disappeared." Molly watched in fascination as Narcissa performed a series of complex duplication charms, creating perfect copies of the most damning documents and storing them in a magically expanded purse that appeared far too small to contain them. The other woman's magical skill was impressive, her movements precise and efficient, despite the time pressure they were under. "I can make copies of the memory vials as well," Narcissa said, moving to the pensieve. "It will take more time, but if we're going to make accusations of this magnitude, we need ironclad evidence." While Narcissa worked, Molly found herself planning their next moves with a clarity that surprised her. The maternal fury burning in her chest had crystallized into cold, strategic thinking. They had perhaps hours before Dumbledore realized the full extent of what they had discovered. They needed to act quickly and decisively. "I can reach Arthur tonight," she said quietly. "And through him, some of the more reasonable members of the Order. People who have children of their own, who would be as horrified by this as we are." "The ministry will be more difficult," Narcissa replied, carefully extracting a memory and duplicating it into a fresh vial. "But I have connections there as well. People who owe my family favors, and others who have no love for Dumbledore's methods, even if they support his cause." They worked together with the efficiency of people who understood the stakes involved. This wasn't about their old feuds anymore, wasn't about blood purity or political ideology. This was about a child who had been systematically tortured by the people who claimed to be protecting him, and about two mothers who refused to let that continue. 3 days, Narcissa said, as she finished copying the last of the crucial memories. "That should give us both time to make the necessary contacts and arrangements. We meet again to coordinate our approach before we move openly." "Where?" Molly asked. "Not here, obviously, and nowhere Dumbledore might think to look for us." "Diagon Alley," Narcissa suggested. "Ollivander's shop, in the back room. Garrick is an old friend of my family, and he has no love for those who abuse children. He'll provide us with a secure location to plan our next moves." They finalized their arrangements quickly, both of them aware that they were running out of time. McGonagall would return soon, and they needed to be gone before she arrived. Too many questions would be raised by their continued presence, especially given Dumbledore's obvious suspicions. As they prepared to leave, Molly found herself looking back at the pensieve and its surrounding memory vials. So much evidence of systematic cruelty, all of it carefully preserved by the perpetrator himself. It was almost as though Dumbledore was proud of what he had done, as though he saw Harry's suffering as a masterpiece of strategic planning, rather than a moral atrocity. 3 days, she repeated, more to herself than to Narcissa. 3 days to gather allies, to build a case that could bring down the most powerful wizard in Britain. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would either save Harry Potter or destroy them all. Narcissa nodded, her pale eyes bright with determination. 3 days, she agreed. And then we end this. They left the office separately, each taking different routes through the castle to avoid being seen together. But as Molly made her way back through the corridors she had walked as a student decades ago, she carried with her not just the evidence of Dumbledore's crimes, but the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her determination to see justice done. Whatever came next, whatever the cost, Harry Potter would finally have someone fighting for him rather than against him. And if that meant bringing down the entire structure of the war they had been fighting, so be it. Some things were more important than victory. Some things were worth any sacrifice. The protection of children was one of them. Chapter 7. Unlikely Allies. Gather. The kitchen of the Burrow had never felt smaller to Molly than it did on that first evening when she sat across from Arthur at their scarred wooden table and tried to find the words to shatter his world. The copied documents were spread between them like evidence at a trial, but Arthur hadn't looked at them yet. He was too busy staring at his wife as though she had grown a second head. "You want me to believe," he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, "that Albus Dumbledore has been systematically torturing Harry Potter for 15 years. Molly, you're talking about the greatest wizard of our time, the man who defeated Grindelwald, the leader of the Order of the Phoenix. I'm talking about a man who documented every beating, every missed meal, every night that child cried himself to sleep in a cupboard," Molly replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Look at the evidence, Arthur. Don't take my word for it. Look at what he wrote in his own hand." Arthur's eyes flicked to the parchments scattered across the table, but he didn't reach for them. "There has to be another explanation. A misunderstanding, or—" "Arthur Weasley," Molly said sharply, using the tone that had stopped their children's arguments for decades. "You've seen Harry every summer. You've seen how thin he is, how he flinches when adults move too quickly, how grateful he is for the smallest kindness. You've seen the bars on his bedroom window for Merlin's sake. When did you stop asking yourself why?" The accusation hit home. Arthur's face flushed, and Molly watched the defensive anger in his eyes give way to something more painful, recognition. He had seen the signs, they all had. But it had been easier to trust in Dumbledore's wisdom than to confront the possibility that the boy they all claimed to care about was being destroyed, piece by piece. "Show me," he said quietly, reaching for the nearest document with hands that shook slightly. Molly watched her husband's face as he read, memorizing every flicker of emotion that crossed his features. First came confusion, then disbelief, then a growing horror that mirrored her own experience in Dumbledore's office. When he reached the correspondence about gift interception protocols, his face went very pale. "The sweaters," he whispered. "You always wondered why Harry never seemed to get them." "Every Christmas, every birthday," Molly confirmed. "And when I asked Dumbledore about it, he said the Dursleys probably thought they were too odd to give to Harry. I believed him. I let him make me believe that Muggle prejudice was more powerful than a mother's love." Arthur continued reading, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When he finished the final document, he sat in silence for several long minutes, staring at the evidence scattered across their kitchen table. "McGonagall," he said finally, "we need to tell Minerva." "Will she believe us?" Molly asked. "Or will she defend him like you almost did?" "She's the one who warned him about the Dursleys in the first place," Arthur replied grimly. "Back in 1981, she spent a full day watching them and told Albus they were the worst sort of muggles imaginable. If anyone's been harboring doubts about Harry's placement, it would be her." 2 days later, Molly found herself sitting in McGonagall's private quarters, watching the deputy headmistress read through the copied evidence with the same sick recognition that had transformed Arthur's skepticism into horror. But unlike Arthur, McGonagall didn't seem entirely surprised by what she was seeing. "I knew," she said quietly, setting down a photograph of 8-year-old Harry with visible bruises on his arms. "Not the full extent, perhaps, but I knew something was terribly wrong. Every year when he returned to school, he was thinner, more withdrawn. Every year I asked Albus about it, and every year he gave me the same answers about necessary sacrifice and the greater good." "Then why didn't you do something?" Arthur asked, though his tone held more pain than accusation. "Because I trusted him," McGonagall replied, her Scottish accent thick with self-recrimination. "Because he was Albus Dumbledore, and I was just a teacher who thought she was seeing shadows where none existed. Because every time I questioned him, he made me feel like a foolish woman who didn't understand the complexities of war. She looked up at them, with eyes bright with unshed tears. How many times could I have saved that boy if I'd had the courage to trust my own instincts? You can trust them now, Molly said gently. Help us. Help us make this right. McGonagall nodded slowly, her expression hardening into something that reminded Molly why the woman had been sorted into Gryffindor rather than Ravenclaw. What do you need? Meanwhile, across London, Narcissa was discovering that her own recruitment efforts faced different but equally significant challenges. The letter she had sent to Azkaban requesting a meeting with Lucius had been returned unopened, stamped with an official ministry seal that informed her that the prisoner was under special restrictions due to ongoing Dark Lord influence concerns. Even if she could have reached her husband, Narcissa realized with growing clarity, it wouldn't have mattered. Lucius was still enthralled by Voldemort's cause, still convinced that their side represented the natural order of things. Presenting him with evidence of Dumbledore's crimes would likely be seen as an opportunity to exploit rather than a moral crisis demanding justice. But there were others, family members and old friends, who had grown weary of the war's toll on their children, who had begun to question whether the cost of victory was becoming too high to bear. Her sister Andromeda lived in a small house near Diagon Alley, having been disowned by the Black family years ago for marrying a Muggle-born. Narcissa, not the specifics, but the pattern, Andromeda replied. Ted used to work at the Ministry, in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. He saw how Dumbledore operated behind the scenes, always manipulating, always positioning people like pieces on a chessboard. When Nymphadora started at Hogwarts, I watched how he treated the students who came from troubled backgrounds. There was always an element of experimentation to his approach. She looked up at Narcissa with sharp eyes that held decades of accumulated resentment. He never tried to help those children, not really. He used their pain to teach lessons to the other students, to create dramatic moments that served his larger purposes. I always wondered what he was doing with the Potter boy, given the circumstances of his placement. Will you help us confront him? I'll do more than that, Andromeda said grimly. I'll help you bring him down. Narcissa's other contacts proved surprisingly receptive to her carefully worded approaches. The Greengrass family, neutral throughout the war, expressed horror at the evidence and agreed to support any effort to protect children from abuse. The Abbotts, longtime allies of neither side, were equally appalled. Even some families traditionally aligned with the Dark Lord's cause found themselves revolted by the systematic torture of a child, regardless of his symbolic importance. We're tired, Margaret Greengrass explained during a tense meeting in her drawing room. Tired of watching our children grow up in fear, tired of choosing between two different brands of extremism. If there's a chance to create something better, something that actually protects our families, instead of using them as weapons, we want to be part of it. By the third day, both women had assembled impressive networks of support that cut across traditional battle lines. Order members horrified by Dumbledore's betrayal of everything they thought they were fighting for. Neutral families desperate for an end to a war that was consuming their children. Even some traditional Death Eater supporters who found themselves questioning whether their cause was worth supporting leaders who would torture children. The meeting at Ollivander's was scheduled for sunset, when the Wandmaker traditionally closed his shop to casual customers. Garrick Ollivander had listened to Narcissa's initial request with the patient attention of a man accustomed to keeping other people's secrets, and had agreed to provide them with a secure location without asking uncomfortable questions about their plans. Molly arrived first, accompanied by Arthur and McGonagall, all three of them tense with the knowledge of what they were about to set in motion. Narcissa came shortly after with Andromeda, the two sisters presenting a united front despite their years of estrangement. Over the next hour, they were joined by nearly 20 others, witches and wizards from across the political spectrum, united by their shared horror at what they had learned about Dumbledore's treatment of Harry Potter. "This is larger than I expected," Molly said quietly to Narcissa as they surveyed the crowded back room of the wand shop. "People have been waiting for someone to give them permission to question him," Narcissa replied. "We just provided the evidence they needed to justify what they already suspected." Garrick Ollivander himself had remained for the meeting, his pale eyes bright with interest as he listened to the assembled group discuss their plans. "In my experience," he said, when asked for his opinion, "the most dangerous wizards are those who believe their own righteousness justifies any action. Albus Dumbledore has been making decisions about other people's lives for so long that I suspect he's forgotten those people have the right to make their own choices." "So you'll support us?" McGonagall asked. "My dear Minerva," Ollivander replied with a slight smile, "I've been waiting for someone to challenge Albus Dumbledore's authority for decades. He's far too comfortable with power for anyone's good, including his own." As the evening wore on, their coalition solidified into something that resembled an actual political movement. They had Order members willing to confront Dumbledore directly, ministry contacts prepared to initiate formal investigations, and neutral families ready to withdraw their support from both sides of the war unless changes were made. But most importantly, they had evidence, copies of documents and memories that could not be dismissed or explained away, proof of crimes so heinous that even Dumbledore's most loyal supporters would be forced to confront the truth about the man they had trusted. "Tomorrow," Molly said, as the meeting drew to a close. "We confront him tomorrow, all of us together. No more operating in shadows, no more allowing him to isolate and manipulate us individually." "Agreed," McGonagall said, her voice steady with resolve. "It's time for Albus Dumbledore to answer for what he's done." As they prepared to leave, each person carrying with them copies of the evidence that would change everything, Molly felt a strange sense of completeness. 3 days ago, she had been a grieving mother trying to understand how the war had gone so wrong. Now, she was part of something larger, a coalition of people who refused to let the protection of children be sacrificed to the ambitions of adults, regardless of how noble those ambitions claimed to be. The confrontation ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and potentially catastrophic for everything they had all believed about their world. But as Narcissa Malfoy moved beside her with the same determined stride, her pale hair and aristocratic bearing creating a stark contrast to Molly's maternal warmth. Together, they represented something unprecedented in the wizarding world, enemies united by a cause more important than their historical differences. "Molly," Arthur called out, rising from his seat with confusion written across his face. "What's going on?" "We're here to discuss Harry Potter's welfare," Molly announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, "and the systematic abuse he has endured for 15 years at the hands of people who claimed to be protecting him." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several Order members began talking at once, some in outrage at the accusation, others in confusion about Narcissa's presence. Ministry officials exchanged worried glances, while the neutral families leaned forward with sharp attention. "Now see here," Kingsley Shacklebolt called out, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "That's a serious accusation to make against me," Dumbledore said quietly, and the hall fell silent once again. His blue eyes were fixed on Molly and Narcissa with the patient attention of a predator evaluating a threat. "I assume that's what you're building toward, my dear Molly. Some sort of accusation against my handling of Harry's placement with his relatives?" "Not an accusation," Narcissa said coolly, drawing a magically expanded folder from her robes. "A presentation of evidence, documented proof of 15 years of systematic torture, carried out with your knowledge and explicit approval." She began distributing copies of documents to the assembled crowd, her movements efficient and professional. Molly moved to a position where she could address the entire group, her maternal authority lending weight to her words. "What you're about to see," Molly said, "will shock you. It will horrify you. It will challenge everything you thought you knew about this war, and the man we've trusted to lead it. But I ask you to remember, as you read these documents and view these memories, that we're talking about a child, a boy who has been systematically tortured by the people who claimed to love him most. The hall erupted in whispered conversations as people began to examine the evidence. Molly watched their faces change as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. First confusion, then disbelief, then growing horror. Medical reports documenting years of abuse, correspondence detailing gift interceptions and emotional manipulation, photographs that showed a child suffering with clinical precision. "This is fabricated," declared Cornelius Fudge from his position near the ministry contingent. "Albus, surely you're not going to dignify these obvious forgeries with a response." "I'm afraid the documents are quite genuine," Dumbledore replied mildly, though something cold had entered his pale blue eyes. "Though I would question the interpretation being placed upon them by our accusers." McGonagall stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor with a sound like breaking bone. "Albus," she said, her Scottish accent thick with emotion, "tell me these medical reports aren't real. Tell me you didn't know that boy was being starved and beaten while you insisted he remain with those people." Dumbledore's silence stretched for several heartbeats too long, and in that pause, several Order members made sounds of physical distress. Emmeline Vance pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as though she might be sick. Remus Lupin stared at the photographs with an expression of absolute devastation. "The measures taken were necessary," Dumbledore said finally, his voice carrying its familiar grandfatherly warmth despite the circumstances. Harry's development required specific conditions to ensure he would be prepared for his ultimate confrontation with Voldemort. The blood wards created by his mother's sacrifice could have been maintained without torture, Narcissa interrupted sharply. "We consulted with 3 different ward specialists. Blood protection requires the child to call the place home, not that he suffer abuse there. You chose to allow his suffering because it served your purposes, not because it was magically necessary." "And what purposes would those be?" asked Amelia Bones, her voice deadly quiet as she studied a document detailing surveillance spells placed on Privet Drive. Molly stepped forward, her voice steady with the authority of absolute moral certainty. "To create the perfect weapon, to shape Harry into someone so desperate for love and acceptance that he would willingly sacrifice himself when the time came. Every friendship monitored and manipulated, every source of comfort systematically removed, every experience of safety carefully rationed to ensure he never expected too much from life." "That's ridiculous," Fudge blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Too many people in the room were nodding in recognition, their faces showing the sick understanding of people who had suspected something was wrong but had never dared to confront it directly. "Is it?" McGonagall asked, turning to face Dumbledore with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Is it ridiculous, Albus? Because I've been asking myself for years why that boy looked so grateful for the smallest kindness, why he never seemed to expect anyone to actually care about his welfare. I told myself I was imagining things, that you knew best." Her voice broke. "But I wasn't imagining anything, was I?" All eyes turned to Dumbledore, waiting for his response. For a moment, his carefully maintained facade slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the grandfatherly warmth. "Harry Potter was raised to understand sacrifice," he said quietly. "To know that some causes are worth any personal cost. The greater good." "Don't you dare!" snarled a voice from the shadows, and every head turned to see Severus Snape stepping into the light. His black eyes burned with a fury that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the hall. "Don't you dare talk about the greater good when you spent 15 years torturing Lily Potter's son." The confession hit the room like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly, while others sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Snape, Dumbledore's most loyal supporter, his most trusted spy, had just publicly confirmed everything Molly and Narcissa had accused him of. Severus, Dumbledore said warningly. But the younger man was beyond caring about consequences. Every year, Snape continued, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Every year I reported to you about that boy's condition. The bruises, the malnutrition, the psychological damage. Every year you told me it was necessary, that his suffering was essential to the war effort. And like a fool, I believed you. I told myself that Lily would have understood, that she would have wanted her son to suffer if it meant defeating the Dark Lord. He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the stone walls like breaking glass. But she wouldn't have, would she? Lily Potter would have burned down the entire wizarding world before she let anyone hurt her child the way you've hurt him. The hall exploded into chaos. Order members were shouting at each other and at Dumbledore, their voices mixing into an incomprehensible roar of betrayal and rage. Ministry officials huddled together, whispering frantically about legal implications and political consequences. The neutral families sat in horrified silence, finally understanding the true cost of the war they had tried so hard to avoid. Through it all, Dumbledore remained seated at the staff table, his hands folded calmly in his lap, as though the destruction of his reputation was merely an interesting academic exercise. When the shouting finally died down to a manageable level, he spoke into the relative quiet. "Everything I have done," he said, with the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to slow students, "has been in service of defeating the most dangerous Dark Lord in history. Harry Potter is not just a boy. He is a weapon in our war against evil. And weapons must be forged in fire if they are to serve their purpose. You may find my methods distasteful, but they have produced exactly the result we needed. A young man willing to face death for the cause of right. A traumatized child who thinks he deserves abuse," McGonagall shot back, her voice cracking with grief and fury. "A boy so starved for affection that he would die for anyone who showed him the smallest kindness. That's not heroism, Albus. That's exploitation of the worst kind." "And it ends now," Molly declared, her voice cutting through the renewed murmur of conversation like a blade. "No more manipulation. No more calculated cruelty. No more treating children like tools in your grand design." She looked around the room, making eye contact with representatives from every faction present. "Harry Potter deserves better. All our children deserve better. And if you won't give it to them, we will." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and Molly could see people throughout the hall beginning to nod in agreement. The evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss, the testimonies too detailed to ignore. Whatever authority Dumbledore had possessed when he entered this hall was crumbling before their eyes, destroyed by the truth of what he had done to a child in the name of the greater good. But even as his support evaporated around him, Albus Dumbledore sat with the calm certainty of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness, and in that certainty, Molly glimpsed something that chilled her more than any Dark Lord's curse, the absolute conviction that he had been right to torture a child, and that he would do it again if given the chance. The war was far from over, but the battle for Harry Potter's soul, and for the souls of all their children, had finally begun in earnest. Chapter 9. The Schism. The corridors of Hogwarts had never carried whispers quite like these. Within an hour of the confrontation in the Great Hall, every portrait was buzzing with fragments of overheard conversation, every ghost was spreading rumors through their ethereal networks, and every house elf was trembling with the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted in the castle's ancient foundations. Molly found herself in McGonagall's office, watching through the window as groups of people disapparated from the grounds in rapid succession. Some left in fury, others in shock, but all of them carried with them the knowledge that would reshape the wizarding world's understanding of their war. "Kingsley just resigned from the Order," Arthur announced as he entered the office, his face pale with the magnitude of what they had set in motion. "Handed in his resignation directly to Dumbledore and said he couldn't serve under a man who tortured children. Emmeline Vance left with him, and Daedalus Diggle. Hestia Jones was crying so hard she could barely disapparate. McGonagall sat behind her desk with the hollow expression of someone whose entire world had been revealed as a lie. "How many?" she asked quietly. "About half, so far," Arthur replied. "The others are demanding an emergency meeting to discuss Dumbledore's removal as Supreme Mugwump and leader of the Order. Alastair wants to take over temporarily, but even he seems shaken by what we learned today." Narcissa appeared in the doorway, having returned from her own urgent meetings. "The neutral families are withdrawing their children from school," she reported without preamble. "The Greengrasses, the Abbotts, the Davies. They're all pulling their students out immediately. They don't trust Hogwarts to protect children if this is what passes for educational leadership." "And your former associates?" McGonagall asked carefully. "In chaos," Narcissa replied with grim satisfaction. "The Death Eaters I still have contact with are horrified that Dumbledore was doing their work for them. Several have sent messages saying they're reconsidering their allegiances if even the light side tortures children. Others are furious that they were denied the pleasure of destroying Potter themselves." She paused. It's difficult to maintain ideological purity when your greatest enemy turns out to share your methods. The implications of that statement settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. The war wasn't just fracturing along new lines, it was revealing that the lines had never been as clear as anyone had believed. How could you fight for the light when its leader employed the dark's own tactics? How could you support the dark when the light was already doing their work for them? "There's more," Arthur said grimly. "Rita Skeeter got hold of the story. I don't know how. Probably someone at the Ministry leaked it. But the Daily Prophet is running a special evening edition. The Boy Who Lived and Suffered. Exclusive investigation into Dumbledore's secret files." It's comprehensive. Molly felt her stomach drop. Rita Skeeter was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. If she had gotten her hands on even portions of the evidence, she would sensationalize it in ways that would make the truth almost impossible to defend against accusations of exaggeration. "We need to get to Harry," she said urgently, "before someone else does, before he learns about this from a newspaper or from someone who doesn't care how it affects him." They found Harry in the Gryffindor common room, sitting alone by the dying fire, while his fellow students whispered in excited clusters around the room. He looked up when they entered. McGonagall, Molly, Arthur, and Narcissa, and something in his green eyes suggested he already knew why they had come. "It's true, isn't it?" he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the shock or disbelief they might have expected. "Everything people are whispering about. Dumbledore really has been watching, planning, making sure I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be." Molly's heart broke at the resignation in his tone. This wasn't a 15-year-old boy learning that trusted adults had betrayed him. This was someone who had always suspected the truth and was simply having his worst fears confirmed. "Harry," she began gently, settling into the chair across from him. "We have a great deal to tell you, and none of it is going to be easy to hear. But I want you to know, first and foremost, that what happened to you was not your fault. None of it. Not the abuse, not the manipulation, not any of it." He laughed bitterly, the sound far too old for his young face. "I know it wasn't my fault, Mrs. Weasley. But I also know that doesn't matter, does it? It still happened. He still let it happen. He still made sure it kept happening, year after year." Narcissa stepped forward, her pale eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that made him look up in surprise. "You're not shocked," she observed. "You're not asking us if we're certain or demanding proof. You already knew." "Not the details," Harry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But yes, I always knew something was wrong. The way he looked at me sometimes, like I was a chess piece, he was moving around the board. The way he never really answered my questions, just gave me these vague responses about patience and trust. The way he always seemed to know exactly what was happening to me at the Dursleys, but never did anything to stop it. He stared into the fire, his hands clenched in his lap. Every summer, I would hope that maybe this time someone would come for me. Maybe this time someone would say, "Enough," and take me away from there. But no one ever did, and after a while, I started to wonder if maybe they were leaving me there on purpose. McGonagall made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand pressed to her mouth as though she could hold back the grief threatening to escape. Arthur's face was ashen, while Molly felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched this boy, this child, acknowledge the systematic betrayal that had defined his entire life. "We're getting you out of there," she said firmly. "You will never spend another night in that house, Harry. I don't care what blood wards or magical protections are involved. We'll find another way." "Will you?" Harry asked, and there was something almost curious in his tone. "Because people have been saying that for years. Ron's always talking about how you'd love to have me stay permanently. Hermione mentions how unfair it is that I have to go back there every summer. Even Sirius writes letters about how he wishes he could give me a proper home." He looked up at them with eyes that held too much knowledge. "But I always end up back at Privet Drive, don't I? Because Dumbledore says it's necessary." "Dumbledore's authority over you ends now," Narcissa said, with cold finality. "Whatever power he thought he had, whatever legal guardianship arrangements he put in place, they're finished. Too many people know the truth now for him to continue operating in the shadows." "And then what?" Harry asked. "What happens when everyone knows that the great Harry Potter, the boy who lived, is really just a broken boy who was tortured into compliance? What happens to your war when people realize their symbol of hope is actually a victim?" The question hung in the air like a curse, highlighting the complexity of what they had unleashed. Harry wasn't just a child who had been abused. He was the public face of the resistance against Voldemort, the symbol that people used to justify their sacrifices and maintain their hope. Learning that he had been systematically destroyed by the people who claimed to be protecting him would shake the foundations of everything people believed about their cause. "We figure it out," Molly said finally, "together. Not with you as a symbol or a weapon or a tool, but as a person with the right to make his own choices about his own life." "Assuming I live long enough to make those choices," Harry replied with the bleak pragmatism of someone who had never expected to see adulthood. "Voldemort still wants me dead. That hasn't changed. And whatever Dumbledore was preparing me for, whatever confrontation he was building toward, it's still coming, isn't it?" Before anyone could answer, the portrait hole burst open, and Hermione Granger tumbled into the common room, clutching a copy of the Evening Daily Prophet in one hand and sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Ron Weasley was close behind her, his freckled face white with shock as he stared at his parents with something approaching accusation. "Is it true?" Hermione demanded, holding up the newspaper with its screaming headline. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me Rita Skeeter is lying like she always does." Molly looked at the paper and felt her heart sink further. The front page featured a photograph of a very young Harry, clearly taken from one of Dumbledore's surveillance files, with the caption, "The Boy Who Suffered, exclusive photos from Dumbledore's secret archives." "It's true," she said quietly, watching her son's face crumble as the words sank in. "All of it." Ron turned to Harry with tears streaming down his face. "Mate," he whispered, "why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say how bad it really was?" "Because what was the point?" Harry replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "What were you going to do about it? What was anyone going to do? Fight Dumbledore? Challenge the great Albus Dumbledore because he wouldn't let an unwanted orphan come stay at your house permanently?" The common room had gone completely silent. every student straining to hear this conversation that would redefine everything they thought they knew about their famous classmate. Harry seemed to become aware of the attention suddenly, his shoulders tensing as he realized that his private pain was becoming public knowledge. "This is why we need to move quickly," Narcissa said, quietly to the adults. "Harry's right. He's not just a victim, he's a symbol. And symbols once broken can either inspire people to demand better or convince them that hope itself is worthless." "What do you suggest?" McGonagall asked. "We protect him," Molly said with fierce determination. "Not from Voldemort, though we'll do that too, but from all the people who are going to want to use this situation for their own purposes. The politicians who'll want to score points against Dumbledore, the reporters who'll want to exploit his pain for readership, the well-meaning people who'll want to turn him into a different kind of symbol. And we give him what Dumbledore never did," Narcissa added. "A choice. About what he wants to do with his life, about how he wants to respond to what was done to him, about whether he wants to continue fighting this war or find some other way to heal." Harry looked up at them with something like surprise, as though the concept of having choices about his own life was genuinely foreign to him. "And if I choose not to be your symbol anymore, if I decide I don't want to be the boy who lived or the chosen one, or whatever title people want to give me, then that's your choice to make," Molly said simply, "and we'll support it, whatever the consequences." Outside the castle walls, the wizarding world was beginning to fracture along new lines as the truth about Harry Potter's treatment spread through every network, every family, every institution that had trusted Albus Dumbledore's wisdom. The war they had been fighting was revealing itself to be far more complex than anyone had imagined, and the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. But in the Gryffindor common room, surrounded by the evidence of how badly the adults in his life had failed him, Harry Potter was finally being offered something he had never had before: the right to determine his own fate. It was a gift more precious than any magic, and more dangerous than any curse. The question now was whether he would have the strength to accept it. Chapter 10. Protecting What Matters. The abandoned manor house in rural Devon had stood empty for decades, its windows dark and gardens overgrown, forgotten by the wizarding families who had once called it home. But as Molly stood in its dusty grand hall 3 days after the confrontation at Hogwarts, she could see the potential hidden beneath years of neglect: high ceilings that could accommodate protective charms, numerous bedrooms for housing displaced students, and most importantly, no connection to either Dumbledore's network or Voldemort's influence. "The wards will need to be completely rebuilt," Narcissa said, running her pale fingers along the doorframe as she examined the manor's magical infrastructure. "Whatever protections this place once had have decayed beyond repair. But that works in our favor. We can create something entirely new, something that doesn't depend on blood sacrifice or systematic suffering." Molly nodded, pulling out the list they had compiled over the past few days. 14 students so far, who want to leave Hogwarts but have nowhere safe to go. More families are considering it, but they're afraid of what might happen if they openly defy Dumbledore. 15, Narcissa corrected quietly. Draco sent an owl this morning. He wants to join the others. The admission carried weight beyond its simple words. Draco Malfoy, scion of one of the most prominent Death Eater families, choosing to align himself with a movement that prioritized protecting children over advancing political causes. It was a defection that would send shockwaves through both sides of the war. "Your family won't forgive this," Molly said gently. "You know that, don't you?" "My family forfeited the right to my loyalty when they chose a cause over their own children," Narcissa replied, her voice steady despite the pain underlying her words. "Lucius sits in Azkaban because he followed a madman who sees people as expendable tools. My sister Bellatrix tortures and kills for sport. They made their choices, and now I'm making mine." They worked together with the efficiency of people who had found their true calling. Molly's experience managing the Burrow's chaotic energy proved invaluable in coordinating the practical aspects of housing and feeding displaced students, while Narcissa's knowledge of advanced protective magic and her access to substantial financial resources provided the foundation for their security measures. The first major test of their partnership came on the third day, when McGonagall arrived with an urgent warning that a group of Dumbledore loyalists were planning to retrieve Harry from what they saw as a dangerous situation. "Alastair's convinced that you're both operating under some form of mental influence," McGonagall explained, her face tight with worry. "He thinks it's impossible that you would willingly work together unless you'd been compromised by dark magic. He's assembling a team to bring Harry back to Grimmauld Place for his own protection." Molly felt her maternal instincts flare into protective fury. His own protection? They want to drag him back to the same people who've been systematically torturing him for 15 years? They believe that Dumbledore's methods, however distasteful, were necessary, McGonagall replied sadly. And they're convinced that without those methods, Harry won't be prepared for his inevitable confrontation with Voldemort. "Then they'll have to go through us," Narcissa said with cold finality, already moving toward the manor's front windows to check their defensive positions. The confrontation came at sunset, when 5 figures apparated onto the manor's front lawn, with the confident stride of people convinced they were performing a rescue operation. Mad-Eye Moody led the group, his magical eye spinning frantically as he scanned the building for threats, while Remus Lupin and 3 other Order members flanked him with their wands drawn. "Harry Potter!" Moody's voice boomed across the grounds, magically amplified to carry through the manor's walls. "We know you're in there, lad. Come out now, and we'll get you somewhere safe." Harry appeared at Molly's shoulder, his face pale but determined. "Let me talk to them," he said quietly. "They won't listen to anyone else." "Absolutely not," Molly replied firmly. "You're 15 years old, Harry. You shouldn't have to." "I've been making life-or-death decisions since I was 11, Harry interrupted, his voice carrying a maturity that broke her heart. "Let me choose this one for myself." Against her better judgment, Molly allowed Harry to step onto the manor's front porch, though she and Narcissa flanked him with their wands ready. The sight of the boy who lived standing voluntarily beside Narcissa Malfoy clearly shocked the Order members, several of whom lowered their wands in confusion. "Professor Lupin," Harry called out, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his small frame. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm exactly where I need to be. These women are protecting me in ways that Dumbledore never did." "Harry, you don't understand," Lupin replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of an adult trying to reason with a confused child. "You've been through a traumatic experience, learning about certain aspects of your placement with your relatives, but that doesn't mean you should make decisions based on temporary emotional responses." "Temporary?" Harry's voice sharpened. "Professor, I've been abused for 14 years. I've been manipulated and monitored and treated like a weapon instead of a person for my entire life. This isn't a temporary emotional response. This is me finally understanding what was done to me and choosing to do something about it." Moody's magical eye fixed on Narcissa with obvious suspicion. "And you trust her? A Death Eater's wife? Someone whose husband tried to kill you multiple times?" "I trust someone who looked at evidence of child abuse and decided to act on it," Harry replied. "I trust someone who's using her own resources to protect children instead of using children to advance her political goals." He looked directly at Moody, unflinching despite the older wizard's intimidating presence. "Can you say the same about Dumbledore?" The question hung in the air like a curse, highlighting the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their position. How could they claim to be protecting Harry by returning him to the people who had orchestrated his abuse? "The boy's been brainwashed," Moody growled, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Dark magic, mind manipulation. There's no other explanation for this." "The only explanation you need," Narcissa said, stepping forward with the regal bearing that had intimidated pure-blood society for decades, "is that some of us believe children deserve better than to be sacrificed for adult ambitions. If that concept seems foreign to you, perhaps you should examine your own principles rather than questioning ours. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, wands drawn and tempers flaring, until Harry made a decision that surprised everyone present. He walked down the manor's front steps, moving directly toward the Order members with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found his courage. "Professor Lupin," he said, stopping just out of wand range. "I want you to look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem unhappy? Do I seem coerced or manipulated or under some kind of magical influence?" Lupin studied Harry's face with the careful attention of someone who had known him since infancy. What he saw there clearly troubled him. Not signs of manipulation or magical compulsion, but something far more disturbing. Peace. For the first time in years, Harry Potter looked genuinely at peace. "You seem—" Lupin paused, struggling to find words for what he was observing. "You seem healthier than I've seen you in years." "That's because, for the first time in my life, I'm in a place where people care about my well-being instead of my usefulness," Harry replied. "I'm with people who ask me what I want, or instead of telling me what I need to sacrifice. I'm finally being protected instead of prepared for slaughter." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Several of the Order members exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Moody's magical eye stopped spinning and fixed on Harry with something approaching recognition. "If you want to help me," Harry continued, "then help us. Help us protect the other children who are caught in this war. Help us build something better than what we've had. But don't try to drag me back to the people who spent 15 years teaching me that my pain was less important than their plans." The confrontation ended not with violence, but with the slow, reluctant recognition that Harry might actually be safer with his former enemies than with his supposed protectors. One by one, the Order members lowered their wands and disapparated, leaving behind only Lupin, who lingered long enough to say something that sounded like an apology, before he too vanished into the growing darkness. Inside the manor, similar scenes played out over the following weeks, as word of their sanctuary spread through the wizarding world's networks of frightened parents and displaced children. Draco Malfoy arrived with 3 other Slytherin students, whose families had been pressured into supporting Voldemort against their wishes. Susan Bones came with her Aunt Amelia's blessing after the ministry official saw the evidence of Dumbledore's crimes. Luna Lovegood simply appeared one morning without explanation, offering to help with the manor's defenses using magic her father had taught her. "It's working," Molly said one evening, as she and Narcissa sat in the manor's restored kitchen, reviewing the day's progress. "The children are healing. They're learning that they don't have to choose between being weapons for the light or the dark." "Harry especially," Narcissa observed, watching through the kitchen window as the boy in question taught some of the younger students basic defensive spells in the garden. "Have you noticed how he carries himself now? He's not looking over his shoulder constantly, waiting for the next blow to fall." Molly had noticed. The change in Harry was remarkable, not dramatic, but profound. He slept through the night without nightmares. He ate meals without constantly checking to make sure no one was going to take his food away. He laughed at jokes and participated in conversations without the desperate eagerness of someone trying to earn affection through perfect behavior. Most importantly, he had begun to express opinions, real opinions, not the careful responses calculated to avoid punishment. He disagreed with Hermione about study methods. He argued with Ron about Quidditch teams. He told Molly when he didn't like her cooking, then immediately panicked and tried to take it back, only relaxing when she laughed and asked what he would prefer instead. They were small things, but they represented a fundamental shift in how Harry saw himself, not as a weapon or a symbol or a burden, but as a person with the right to preferences and boundaries and basic human dignity. "We've given him something Dumbledore never did," Narcissa said quietly. We've given him the chance to discover who he might have been if he hadn't spent his entire life preparing to die. Outside, Harry was demonstrating a Patronus charm to Luna and Neville, the silver stag leaping joyfully around the garden in the evening light. It was still the same Patronus, still connected to his father's memory, but there was something different about it now, something less desperate, more hopeful. "The question," Molly said, watching her son Ron join the impromptu lesson with his usual enthusiasm, "is whether we can keep him safe long enough for him to figure out who that person wants to be." The war was still out there, waiting. Voldemort still wanted Harry dead, and Dumbledore still believed his methods were justified by their results. But here, in this hidden manor, surrounded by children who had chosen protection over politics, Harry Potter was finally learning that some things, safety, love, the right to make your own choices, were worth any sacrifice to defend. And for the first time since that Halloween night when his parents died, he was beginning to believe that he might actually deserve them. Chapter 11. The New Order. The transformation of their small refuge into something larger had happened gradually, then all at once. What began as a safe house for displaced students had grown into a network of connected families, a communication system that spanned the entire British wizarding community, and finally, inevitably, a genuine political movement that neither Albus Dumbledore nor Lord Voldemort had anticipated. Molly stood in the main parlour of the Devon Manor, now expanded through careful extension charms to accommodate the dozens of people who had requested sanctuary over the past month. The room buzzed with quiet conversations in multiple languages as representatives from across magical Britain discussed strategies, shared resources, and planned for a future that looked nothing like the war they had been fighting. The Patil family has offered their estate in Yorkshire as a secondary location, Padma Patil was explaining to a mixed group that included former Order members, disaffected Death Eater wives, and neutral families who had grown tired of choosing between two forms of extremism. They have excellent defensive capabilities and can house another 20 families if needed. The Delacours have sent word from France, added Apolline Delacour, who had arrived that morning with her daughters and a contingent of French wizards horrified by the reports of systematic child abuse. The International Confederation of Wizards is watching this situation with great interest. They are prepared to offer support if we can demonstrate that we represent a viable alternative to the current madness. Narcissa moved through the crowd with the elegant efficiency of someone born to manage complex social dynamics, coordinating logistics, and mediating disputes with a skill that reminded Molly why the pure blood families had once wielded such political influence. But there was something different about her approach now, less manipulation, more genuine collaboration. "We have a problem," Arthur announced as he entered the parlour, his face grim with concern. "Scrimgeour's people at the ministry are getting nervous. They're talking about declaring us an unlawful assembly and shutting down our operations." "On whose authority?" demanded Amelia Bones, who had officially resigned her ministry position 3 days earlier to join their movement. "We haven't broken any laws. We're protecting children and providing sanctuary to people who don't want to participate in a war that's consuming their families." "On Dumbledore's recommendation," Arthur replied quietly. "He's convinced Fudge that we represent a dangerous destabilization of the war effort. Apparently, our refusal to choose sides is somehow worse than choosing the wrong side." A ripple of anger moved through the assembled crowd, but it was Harry who stepped forward to address the group. Over the past month, he had grown into his role as something more than just a symbol. He had become a spokesperson for children who had been used as pawns in adult conflicts, and his words carried weight precisely because he spoke from experience rather than ideology. "Then we make our position public," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite his still slight frame. "We stop hiding what we're doing and start showing people that there's a third option, that they don't have to choose between Dumbledore's calculated cruelty and Voldemort's open brutality." A public demonstration? McGonagall asked, her Scottish accent sharpened by concern. Harry, that would be incredibly dangerous. Both sides would see it as a direct challenge to their authority. Good, Harry replied with a hardness that reminded everyone present of exactly what he had survived. Because that's exactly what it is. The rally was planned for the following Saturday in Diagon Alley, using the public square outside Gringotts Bank, neutral ground that neither Dumbledore nor Voldemort could claim as their territory. Word spread through their network with the efficiency of people who had learned to communicate without relying on traditional channels, carried by house elves, delivered through Patronus messages, and whispered in shop queues by people who had grown tired of living in fear. By the appointed day, nearly 300 people had gathered in the square, representing every house of Hogwarts, every social class of magical Britain, and several foreign delegations who had come to witness what some were calling the most significant political development since the war began. They stood together in defiance of every traditional division. Purebloods beside Muggle-borns, former Death Eaters next to Order members, ministry officials alongside shopkeepers and students. Molly looked out over the crowd from the makeshift platform they had erected, feeling a mixture of pride and terror at what they had accomplished. This was no longer about Harry Potter, or even about child abuse. It had become about the fundamental question of what kind of world they wanted to live in, and who had the right to make decisions about other people's lives. "Friends," she began, her voice amplified by sonorous charms to reach every corner of the square, "we are here today, not as enemies of the light or the dark, but as people who believe that children deserve better than to be sacrificed for adult ambitions. We are here as families who refuse to choose between two forms of extremism, both of which treat people as expendable tools in service of abstract ideals." The crowd responded with applause, but it was Narcissa who delivered the message that truly resonated with their mixed audience. She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen both sides of the war from the inside and found them both wanting. "For too long," she said, her clear voice carrying across the square, "we have been told that we must choose between the lesser of two evils, that we must accept cruelty from our leaders because the alternative is somehow worse, that our children must suffer and die because the cause is more important than their lives." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We reject that choice. We reject the premise that good ends justify evil means, and we reject any leader who demands that we sacrifice our children for their vision of victory." The rally's peaceful beginning was shattered when masked figures appeared at 3 points around the square, Death Eaters who had come to silence this challenge to their master's authority. But the protective wards Narcissa and her allies had woven around the gathering held firm, deflecting curses and containing explosions, while the crowd maintained its position with remarkable discipline. "You see?" Harry called out, as the Death Eaters' attack failed to penetrate their defenses. "This is what protection actually looks like. Not blood wards built on suffering, not sacrificial magic that demands pain, but collaborative defense built on people working together to keep each other safe." The failed attack seemed to galvanize rather than frighten the crowd, and when Albus Dumbledore himself appeared at the edge of the square 20 minutes later, the response was immediate and unmistakable. A wall of people formed between him and the platform, not with wands drawn in aggression, but with arms linked in solidarity. "Molly," Dumbledore called out, his familiar grandfatherly voice carrying easily across the square despite the crowd's hostile murmur. "Surely we can discuss this privately. There's no need for such public displays when reasonable people can find common ground through dialogue." "We tried dialogue," Molly replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of confronting the man she had once trusted implicitly. 15 years ago, when I asked why Harry couldn't stay with us permanently. 5 years ago, when I questioned why he always came back from the Dursleys thinner and more withdrawn. 3 years ago, when I begged you to let me adopt him formally." Her voice rose with each example. "Every time you gave me the same answer. Trust your wisdom. Accept that you knew best. Believe that the greater good required his suffering." "And it did," Dumbledore replied, and the casual certainty in his voice sent a ripple of revulsion through the crowd. "Harry Potter needed to understand sacrifice, needed to be prepared for the ultimate confrontation that awaits him. My methods may have been difficult, but they produced exactly the result They produced a traumatized child who spent his entire life believing he deserved abuse," McGonagall interrupted, stepping forward from the crowd with tears streaming down her face. "They produced a boy so desperate for affection that he would die for anyone who showed him basic kindness. That's not heroism, Albus. That's exploitation." "And it ends now," Narcissa added, moving to stand beside McGonagall in a show of unity that would have been impossible just months earlier. "We offer you one final chance to step down voluntarily, to acknowledge the harm you have done, and allow others to clean up the mess you have made. But whether you accept that offer or not, your authority over these children ends today." Dumbledore's blue eyes hardened behind his half-moon spectacles, revealing the steel beneath his grandfatherly facade. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said quietly. "The war against Voldemort requires sacrifices that soft hearts cannot comprehend. Without proper preparation, without the necessary hardening of resolve, Harry Potter will fall, and the Dark Lord will triumph. Your sentimentality will doom us all." "Then we'll find another way," Harry said, stepping to the front of the platform where everyone could see him clearly. "We'll find a way to stop Voldemort that doesn't require torturing children. We'll build something better than what you've given us. Something that protects people instead of using them." The crowd erupted in cheers, but it was the group of people who approached the platform from the back of the square that truly marked the moment's significance. Former Death Eaters led by a pale, nervous young man Molly recognized as Theodore Nott. Disillusioned Order members including Kingsley Shacklebolt and Emmeline Vance. Ministry officials who had grown tired of being caught between two extremes. Hogwarts students who had walked out of their classes to join a movement that promised to value their lives over their utility. "We, the undersigned," Amelia Bones read from a scroll that had been prepared for this moment, "declare our independence from both the so-called Order of the Phoenix under Albus Dumbledore's leadership and the Death Eaters under Lord Voldemort's command. We reject their authority to make decisions about our lives, our children's lives, and our community's future. We commit ourselves to building a world where protection means safety, not suffering, where leadership means service, not domination, and where children are valued for who they are, not what they can be made to sacrifice." The scroll was signed there in the square, with hundreds of witnesses and the full knowledge that they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. They were no longer trying to reform the existing order. They were rejecting it entirely in favor of something that had never existed before. As the crowd began to disperse, carrying word of what had happened to every corner of magical Britain, Molly found herself standing beside Narcissa in the square's center, surrounded by the evidence of what they had accomplished together. "We've started something," Narcissa said quietly, watching families walk away together in groups that crossed every traditional boundary. "Something that can't be stopped or controlled or manipulated by people who think they know better than we do about our own lives. The question now," Molly replied, "is whether we can hold it together long enough to see it through to the end." The war was far from over, but the battle for the right to determine their own future, for themselves and for their children, had finally begun in earnest. And for the first time since the whole nightmare started, Molly Weasley felt genuinely hopeful about what they might build from the ashes of the old world. Chapter 12. Beyond Agreement. 6 months later. September 1996. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of what had once been the Devon Manor's formal dining room, now converted into the administrative heart of the Children's Protection Coalition. Molly sat at a desk that had been expanded to accommodate stacks of correspondence from across magical Europe, each letter representing another family, another child, another community that had chosen protection over politics. The Beauxbatons delegation confirmed their arrival for next week's education summit, Hermione Granger announced, as she entered with an armload of translated documents. At 16, she had become one of their most effective liaisons with international magical governments, her remarkable intellect finally directed toward something more meaningful than academic achievement. They want to implement our student protection protocols in French magical schools. And the Germans? Molly asked, looking up from a report about their newest safe house in Scotland. Very interested, but they want to see our long-term results before committing to major changes, Hermione replied, which is reasonable, considering we're asking them to completely restructure how they think about magical education. Through the window, Molly could see the grounds that had been transformed over the past months from a single refuge into something unprecedented in wizarding history, a community where children from every background learned together, protected by adults who had chosen their welfare over political advantage. The sight never failed to fill her with quiet satisfaction, particularly when she spotted Harry among a group of younger students, demonstrating defensive spells with the patient competence of someone who had finally found his calling. He looked different now, not just healthier, though that was certainly true. The hollow-eyed wariness that had defined him for so long had been replaced by something that could only be described as contentment. He slept through the night without nightmares. He ate meals without the desperate efficiency of someone expecting his food to be taken away. Most importantly, he had learned to say no to people who wanted to use his fame, to adults who tried to make decisions for him, to anyone who suggested that his past suffering entitled them to his future sacrifice. "Mrs. Weasley," came a familiar voice from the doorway, and Molly looked up to see Narcissa entering with her own collection of morning reports. The transformation in the other woman was just as remarkable as Harry's, though perhaps more subtle. The rigid aristocratic bearing remained, but it had been tempered by something warmer, more genuine. The ministry vote is confirmed. Kingsley will be the new Minister for Magic, and his first official act will be to formally recognize our coalition as an independent educational authority. "And Dumbledore?" Molly asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Stripped of all official positions and facing formal charges for child endangerment, abuse of authority, and violation of multiple international laws regarding the treatment of war refugees," Narcissa replied with grim satisfaction. "His supporters have all but disappeared. It's difficult to defend someone when the evidence of their crimes is so comprehensive and public." They had learned over the past months that Dumbledore's meticulous documentation of Harry's abuse had become the instrument of his own downfall. Every memory, every photograph, every clinical report had been scrutinized by international magical law experts who had pronounced themselves horrified by what they discovered. The man who had once been considered the greatest wizard of his generation was now facing the possibility of spending his remaining years in Azkaban. "And Voldemort?" Molly asked, though this answer she already knew. "Dead," Narcissa said simply. "Killed not by a chosen one or a prophecy, but by a coalition of people who refused to let him terrorize their families any longer. He never understood that his real weakness wasn't Harry Potter. It was that he had based his entire movement on fear, and people had finally found something more powerful than their fear. The Dark Lord's defeat had come not through some grand confrontation between good and evil, but through the methodical dismantling of his support structure. When families across magical Britain began choosing their children's safety over ideological purity, Voldemort found himself without the base of operations, financial support, and fresh recruits that had sustained his movement. His inner circle had fractured, as parents like the Malfoys and Knots abandoned his cause in favor of protecting their children. His terror tactics lost their effectiveness when people had somewhere safe to go. In the end, he had been cornered in a decrepit mansion in Albania by a mixed force of Aurors, former Death Eaters, and Coalition volunteers, all of them united not by loyalty to any particular leader, but by their determination to end a war that was consuming their children. The final battle had lasted less than an hour. Harry's made his decision about next year, Narcissa continued, settling into the chair across from Molly's desk with the easy familiarity of a long-standing partnership. He wants to stay with the Coalition full-time, working with children who've been displaced by the conflict. He says he's finally found something that feels more important than his fame. Molly smiled, remembering the conversation where Harry had explained his choice with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust his own judgment. He didn't want to be a symbol or a hero. He wanted to be someone who helped other children find safety when the adults in their lives failed them. The new Hogwarts curriculum has been approved, she said, pulling out a document that represented months of collaborative effort between educators, child welfare experts, and parents who had demanded better for their children. No more house divisions based on personality traits. No more tolerance for bullying disguised as tradition. No more teachers who believe that cruelty builds character. McGonagall seems pleased with her new role, Narcissa observed, though I think she's still processing the guilt about not acting sooner. We all are, Molly replied quietly. But the important thing is that we're acting now. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, reviewing applications from families who wanted to join their community, approving expansion plans for their network of safe houses, and coordinating with international allies who were implementing similar reforms in their own countries. It was work that neither of them had ever imagined doing, but which had become as natural as breathing. I never thanked you, Narcissa said suddenly, looking up from her correspondence with an expression that was unusually vulnerable, for giving me the chance to be better than I was, for not judging me based on my family's choices, for helping me find a way to protect children instead of sacrificing them. We helped each other, Molly replied, setting down her own papers to give Narcissa her full attention. You gave me the resources and knowledge I needed to actually make a difference, instead of just worrying helplessly. You showed me that protecting children was more important than old grudges or political loyalty. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found that file in Dumbledore's office, Narcissa mused. If we had continued to trust in his wisdom, to believe that his methods were justified by his results. Harry would have died, Molly said with quiet certainty. Not in some grand, heroic sacrifice, but as a broken boy who had been conditioned to believe that his pain was less important than other people's cause. And we would have let it happen because we were too afraid to question the people we thought knew better than we did. The thought hung between them like a prayer of gratitude for the accident that had changed everything. Narcissa's cloak catching on that table edge, the files scattering across Dumbledore's Persian rug. Two mothers discovering that their children mattered more than the war they had been fighting. Through the window, they could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation from the grounds where their extended family had gathered for the afternoon. Harry was teaching Ron and Hermione some advanced defensive magic, while Draco and Luna worked on protection charms nearby. Ginny and Neville were helping some of the younger children with their homework. Even Severus Snape, freed from his obligations to both Dumbledore and Voldemort, was visible at the edge of the group, offering quiet advice to students who sought his expertise without fear of his sharp tongue. Look at them, Narcissa said, following Molly's gaze. They're not divided by house or blood status or family history. They're just children, learning together, protecting each other, becoming the kind of people they want to be instead of the people adults tried to make them. It's what we fought for, Molly replied, watching her youngest son argue cheerfully with Harry about Quidditch strategies, while Hermione rolled her eyes and continued reading her book. A world where children get to be children, where families get to make their own choices about their own lives, where no one has the right to sacrifice other people for their vision of the greater good. As evening settled over their community, families began to gather for dinner in the Manor's great hall, not the formal state occasions of Narcissa's youth or the chaotic but loving meals of Molly's household, but something new, a chosen family that spanned every traditional division, united not by blood or ideology, but by their shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. Harry sat between Ron and Luna, no longer the isolated boy who ate in desperate silence, but someone who participated in conversations, argued good-naturedly about trivial matters, and accepted affection without the desperate gratitude of someone who expected it to be withdrawn at any moment. Draco, freed from the crushing weight of his family's expectations, had discovered a talent for making people laugh and a genuine gift for protective magic. Hermione had found outlets for her intelligence that didn't require her to prove herself worthy of acceptance. "We did this," Narcissa said quietly, as they watched their extended family share stories and plan for tomorrow. Two women who had never agreed on anything, who came from opposite sides of every conflict, who had every reason to hate each other. "We found something more important than our differences." "We found something worth protecting," Molly corrected gently, "and we learned that protection means creating safety, not accepting suffering. It means building something better, not just fighting against something worse." The evening continued around them with the easy rhythm of people who had found their place in the world, who no longer had to choose between impossible alternatives or sacrifice their children for adult ambitions. In the garden beyond the windows, fireflies began to dance among the flowers that Luna had insisted on planting, their gentle light reflecting the peaceful certainty that tomorrow would bring another day of growing, learning, and healing in safety. Two mothers who had started as enemies had become partners, then friends, then something even more precious, proof that people could change, that old wounds could heal, and that love for children could overcome any division adult politics might create. The war was over, not because one side had defeated the other, but because enough people had chosen to stop fighting and start protecting instead. And in the quiet satisfaction of that victory, Molly and Narcissa had found something they had never expected to discover, a future where children could grow up believing that they deserved safety, love, and the right to determine their own destinies. It was, they agreed, the best possible ending to a story that had begun with nothing but pain and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would finally say, enough. Someone had. They had. And the children were safe.